Cold steel bit into Emma Davis's wrists as she tested the strength of the chains binding her to the concrete pillar. The warehouse air hung thick with the scent of motor oil and something chemical she couldn't quite place. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she calculated her odds. 24 hours ago, she'd been helping her father replace a transmission. Now she was bait in a trap not meant for her. The heavy metal door clanged shut as Ray Snake Harlow, the man who had terrorized her father's small town for months, finally left. His parting words echoed in the cavernous space. "Your old man has 3 hours to sign over that garage. Otherwise," he'd let the threat hang unfinished unnecessary. Emma controlled her breathing, 4 counts and 4 counts out, just as Michael had taught her. Michael, her husband, the man who most people in Oak Ridge believed worked government contracts overseas. Not entirely a lie. She recalled their last encrypted call 3 weeks ago. His voice had been tight controlled. "If anything happens, check the lockbox under the basement workbench. There's a satellite phone, 1-number program." The bikers had no idea who they were really dealing with. They saw her father as a stubborn old mechanic. They saw her as leverage. What they didn't see was that her husband wasn't just any soldier, he was Delta Force. And this is what happens when you touch a Delta operator's family. Oak Ridge, Arizona, 1991. A town that time seemed to forget where neon signs still buzzed and flickered over family-owned businesses that had weathered decades of economic storms. The kind of place where classic rock poured from garage radios and men still removed their hats when greeting a lady. At the eastern edge of town, Carol's Auto Repair sat like a monument to American craftsmanship. The faded red brick building had stood since 1952, its weathered sign promising honest work at honest prices. Inside the main bay, the unmistakable rumble of a Ford Mustang's 390 V8 engine reverberated against concrete walls adorned with vintage automobile advertisements and Arizona license plates from every decade since the 40s. Jim Carroll, 68, leaned over the engine compartment, his silver hair catching the morning light that streamed through the high windows. His calloused hands moved with the precision of a surgeon as he adjusted the timing on the distributor. Sweat darkened the back of his faded blue work shirt, despite the cooling fans strategically positioned around the garage. "Listen to that purr," Jim said to no one in particular, a smile creasing his weathered face. "They don't make 'em like this 67 anymore. Too much computer, not enough metal." He straightened up, suppressing a wince as pain lanced through his lower back. When he was sure no one was looking, he reached into his pocket, palmed 2 white pills, and swallowed them dry. The doctor had given him 6 months. That was 4 months ago. The pain was getting worse, but Jim refused the stronger medication. Rather feel something than nothing at all, he'd told the oncologist, who'd looked at him with a mixture of respect and resignation. Jim had chosen to keep his condition from Emma. His daughter had enough to worry about with Michael deployed. She didn't need to be counting down her father's days too. The bell above the front door chimed. 3 of his regulars, Bill Masters, Frank Holloway, and Tom Richards, shuffled in coffee cups in hand from Maggie's diner across the street. "Morning, Jim," Bill called out. At 72, he was the eldest of the trio, a retired railroad engineer who still wore his company cap like a badge of honor. "Gentlemen," Jim nodded, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better days. "What brings you by this early?" "Same thing as always," Frank said, lowering himself onto a worn leather couch in the waiting area. "Hiding from our wives and looking for free coffee?" Jim chuckled, moving to the pot he kept brewing all day. "Coffee I can provide. Sanctuary is getting scarcer these days." Tom, the youngest, at 64 and a former county sheriff, leaned against the counter. His expression was more serious than usual. "Heard those Desert Scorpions were back in town last night. Big group this time. Maybe 15 bikes." Jim's hand paused momentarily as he poured the coffee. "Where'd you see them?" "Coming in off the interstate around midnight, headed toward the old McKinley property." Tom accepted the steaming mug with a nod of thanks. "Something about them doesn't sit right, Jim. They ain't your typical weekend warriors playing dress-up." The front door chimed again. Emma Davis stepped in sunlight, briefly haloing her athletic frame. At 37, she had her mother's beauty and her father's intensity, dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, keen blue eyes that didn't miss much, and the confident stride of someone comfortable in their own skin. She carried a brown paper bag that smelled of fresh pastries. "Morning, gentlemen." She smiled, setting the bag on the counter. I brought reinforcements. Emma girl, Frank beamed. You're a sight for sore eyes. How long you staying this time? Until Michael's tour ends, she said, distributing Danish pastries. Dad needs the help and the high school in Phoenix can find another substitute teacher. What Emma didn't say was that Michael had insisted she stay with her father. His last call had been unusual clipped phrases and coded words that told her something was happening, something that might reach Oak Ridge. Jim watched his daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. She was smart as a whip engineering degree. She'd put on hold when she met Michael, and tougher than most men he knew. But she was still his little girl, and the thought of leaving her alone in this world gnawed at him more than the cancer. Brought you something, she said to Jim, handing him a bear claw, his favorite. You're spoiling an old man, he replied, then nodded toward the Mustang. Want to help me finish up Eleanor Owner's picking her up this afternoon? Emma's eyes lit up. Eleanor, huh? You still naming the classics after women? Only the beautiful ones, Jim winked. This one's been temperamental, though. Just like her namesake, I bet. Emma laughed, already rolling up her sleeves. The men watched as father and daughter fell into an easy rhythm, working on the car, with a synchronicity that came from years of shared knowledge. What most people didn't know was that Emma could diagnose an engine problem faster than many mechanics with decades of experience, a gift she'd inherited from Jim, and honed through years of helping in the shop during summers and weekends. As the morning progressed, Tom, Frank, and Bill discussed the changing face of Oak Ridge, how the younger generation was moving away, how businesses were struggling, and most concerning, how drugs were finding their way into schools and street corners. It's those bikers, Bill muttered. Mark my words, they ain't just passing through. None of them noticed how intently Emma listened while she worked, or how her father's expression hardened at the mention of the desert scorpions. The Carroll family home sat on 3 acres at the edge of town, a modest ranch house with a wraparound porch and a detached workshop where Jim often retreated when the demons of his past grew too loud. The property had been in the family since Jim's father returned from World War II and decided Arizona's desert landscape reminded him of the peace he'd found in North Africa. Evening settled over the house as Emma stirred a pot of her mother's famous chili, a recipe Catherine Carroll had perfected over 30 years of marriage before cancer took her 12 years ago. The same disease now eating away at Jim, though Emma remained unaware. Need any help? Jim asked, entering the kitchen with the day's mail. Just set the table, Emma replied, adding a pinch of cayenne to the pot. Almost ready. Jim laid out 2 plates on the worn oak table that had hosted thousands of family meals. His movements were measured, conserving energy he no longer had in abundance. On the counter, a small television played the local news, the anchor's voice a background murmur until the words drug trafficking caused both Carrolls to look up. Federal authorities report a significant increase in narcotics moving across the Arizona-Mexico border, the anchor said gravely. Officials believe sophisticated smuggling networks are establishing new routes through remote areas, including several small towns previously untouched by cartel influence. Emma and Jim exchanged a glance but said nothing. As they sat down to eat, the comfortable silence between them spoke of shared concerns too complex for casual conversation. So, Jim finally said, heard from Michael lately. Emma's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Last week. Brief call, you know how it is? Jim nodded. Military families lived with gaps in communication, with half-truths and carefully worded letters. Jim had put his own family through similar trials during his consulting work in the 1980s. He's good, though, Jim pressed gently. He's Michael. Emma smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Strong as ever. Worried about me as usual. After dinner, Emma excused herself to make a call. In the guest bedroom that had once been hers, she locked the door, pulled out a satellite phone from her duffel bag, and punched in a series of numbers no civilian should know. The connection crackled. 2 rings, then silence. Checkmate, she said quietly. A pause. Rook to King's Bishop 3, came the reply, Michael's voice tight with tension but steady. Status. Emma kept her voice even professional. Still in position. Intel suggests movement within 2 weeks. A pause. How's the local situation? Deteriorating. Desert scorpions increasing presence. 15 sighted yesterday. Another pause. Check the secure package. Use Protocol 7 if necessary. His voice softened slightly. I miss you, Em. Miss you too, she whispered, the facade of military precision cracking just enough to reveal the woman who loved a warrior. Stay safe. Always. Out. The connection died. Emma sat motionless for several minutes processing. Whatever Michael was tracking had connections to Oak Ridge, that much was clear. And it involved the desert scorpions. She moved to the closet, pulled up the false bottom in her suitcase, and retrieved a small key. The locked chest under the bed contained items that would raise eyebrows in a civilian household: a Beretta 9mm with silencer, 3 extra magazines, a military-grade first aid kit, night vision monocular, and a secured tablet with satellite uplink capabilities. Standard equipment for the wife of a Delta Force operator who sometimes found herself in the periphery of his dangerous world. Meanwhile, Jim sat in his workshop, an old photo album open on his workbench. The yellow-tinged photographs told a story few in Oak Ridge would believe: Jim Carroll, 30 years younger, standing with groups of men whose faces were sometimes deliberately blurred. Jungle backdrops, military aircraft, weapons not available to civilians. One photo showed Jim shaking hands with a man in a suit outside a nondescript government building. The back of the photo was stamped Operation Just Cause Panama, 1989, cleared for subject only. Jim Carroll had never been just a mechanic. As a CIA technical operations officer, he had spent 15 years supporting covert operations throughout Latin America, installing surveillance equipment, maintaining vehicles for extraction teams, and occasionally joining operations when his unique skills were required. His cover as a mechanic had been perfect, allowing him to travel throughout the region as a consultant for American automobile companies, expanding into emerging markets. When he finally retired in 1990 after the successful Operation Just Cause in Panama, he'd returned to Oak Ridge to run his father's garage and raise Emma in peace. Or so he had thought. The sound of tires on gravel pulled Jim from his memories. Through the workshop window, he recognized the ancient Bronco, belonging to Walter Hayes, Oak Ridge's 70-year-old sheriff, a man who had been in law enforcement since the Kennedy administration and refused to retire despite the town council's increasingly unsubtle hints. Jim tucked the album away in a locked drawer before stepping outside to greet his old friend. "Evening, Walt," Jim called. "Little late for a social style, no." Sheriff Hayes's weathered face was grim in the porch light. "Wish it was social, Jim. Got something you need to know." Inside the kitchen, Jim poured 2 fingers of bourbon for each of them. Walter took a long sip before speaking. "2 of my deputies quit today, Holbrook and Mendez." Jim raised an eyebrow. "Those young fellows you hired last year?" Walter nodded. "Both bought new trucks last week. Cash. When I asked about it, they handed in their badges." He leaned forward. "Something's happening, Jim. I've got 4 deputies left, and I don't trust half of them." "The Scorpions." "Has to be. They've been recruiting local muscle-spreading cash around." Walter's knuckles whitened around his glass. "The days when a man's word meant something are fading, Jim. These kids today, they don't understand honor or duty. Just dollar signs." Jim's eyes drifted to the window beyond which his daughter was somewhere into the house. "Any idea what they're planning?" "Drugs for sure, but it's bigger than that. They're buying property through shell companies, strategic locations." Walter fixed Jim with a knowing look. "Like that empty lot across from your garage." Jim's expression remained neutral, but his mind raced. The lot offered clear sight lines to his garage and the road leading south, a perfect surveillance position. Or worse. "You still keep in touch with your old friends in the government?" Walter asked carefully. The 2 men had an unspoken agreement. Walter knew Jim had been more than a mechanic, but never asked for details Jim couldn't provide. "Haven't for years," Jim replied, which was mostly true. "But I'll make some calls." After Walter left, Jim found Emma on the porch staring at the star-filled desert sky. "Sheriff Hayes looked worried," she said without turning. "Walter's always worried. It's his job." Jim eased himself into a rocking chair beside her, his joints protesting. "Dad," Emma began, then hesitated. "If there's something I should know about these desert scorpions." Jim studied his daughter's profile, so like her mother's, yet with a hardness Catherine had never possessed. Emma had chosen a warrior for a husband. Perhaps she'd always recognized something in herself that resonated with that life. "They're more organized than your typical motorcycle gang," Jim admitted. "Walter thinks they're setting up operations here for drug running, using remote towns as distribution points." "And they want your garage," Emma stated flatly. "Not a question." Jim nodded. "Perfect location, highway access, large storage areas, repair facilities for their vehicles. Have they approached you yet? Not directly, but they will. Emma turned to face him, her expression resolute. When they do, I'll be there. Jim reached out to cover his daughter's hand with his own. Emma, honey, I've handled tough customers before. I know, Dad, she said softly. I know more than you think. The weight of unspoken secrets hung between them as crickets chirped in the Arizona night. The thundering approach of Harley-Davidsons broke the mid-morning quiet outside Carol's auto repair. Not just any Harley's custom Softail Deluxes and Road Kings with reinforced frames and modified engines that push their performance well beyond factory specifications. The kind of bikes that cost more than what most Oak Ridge residents made in a year. Jim was beneath a Chevy pickup when the first vibrations resonated through the concrete floor. He recognized the distinctive rumble of V-twin engines tuned to intimidate. Sliding out from under the vehicle, he wiped his hands and nodded to Emma, who was updating the shop's inventory on the ancient computer behind the counter. Expecting anyone, she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Not anyone I invited, Jim replied, his voice level despite the quickening of his pulse. 7 motorcycles pulled into the gravel lot in precise formation, a choreographed arrival meant to impress and intimidate. The riders were a mix of stereotypes and surprises, leather vests adorned with the Desert Scorpion's insignia, heavy boots, bandanas. But these weren't the undisciplined weekend warriors that sometimes pass through town. These men moved with military precision as they dismounted and secured their machines. Their leader stood out immediately, taller than the others, with the lean, coiled physique of a predator. Unlike his companions, he wore no helmet, revealing close-cropped gray hair and a face that had seen its share of violence. Most distinctive was the stylized scorpion tattoo that began under his right ear and disappeared beneath his collar, its tail curving up his neck. Ray Snake Harlow, Emma whispered, recognizing him from her research. Jim gave an almost imperceptible nod. He'd read the file Emma didn't know he had access to. Former Navy SEAL dishonorably discharged in 1908 after an operation in Central America went catastrophically wrong, with allegations of excessive force and civilian casualties. The Navy had buried the details, but the end result was a highly trained killer with a grudge against the system that had created him, the most dangerous kind of man. Snake paused at the garage entrance, surveying the interior like a general assessing a battlefield. His gaze lingered on Emma before shifting to Jim. A smile that contained no warmth spread across his face. Mr. Carroll, he said, his voice surprisingly cultured. Sorry to interrupt your workday. Jim straightened to his full height, ignoring the pain in his back. We're open to paying customers. You gentlemen need work done on those Harleys. Snake chuckled, glancing back at his men who remained by their bikes, a show of respect that seemed calculated rather than genuine. Actually, I'm here about a different kind of business proposition. Snake stepped further inside, boots echoing on concrete. I represent a development group interested in acquiring properties in Oak Ridge. Strategic investments, you might say. My garage isn't for sale, Jim replied evenly. Snake continued as if he hadn't spoken. Your location is particularly valuable to our operation. Highway access, large workspace. His eyes drifted to the attached storage buildings. Plenty of room for expansion. From behind the counter, Emma watched the exchange with outward calm that belied her racing thoughts. She noted that 2 of Snake's men had positioned themselves to monitor the street, while another kept his hand suspiciously close to his jacket, armed almost certainly. I'm prepared to offer $50,000, Snake said, reaching into his vest to produce an envelope. Cash, today. Jim didn't even glance at the envelope. This business has been in my family for 3 generations. It's not for sale at any price. Something darkened in Snake's eyes, a flash of genuine anger quickly masked. Mr. Carroll, I don't think you understand the opportunity here. Oak Ridge is changing. Small businesses like yours are struggling. This offer is generous. Generous would be twice the market value, Emma interjected, moving to stand beside her father. Your offer isn't even a quarter of that. Snake's attention shifted to Emma, his gaze calculating. You must be the daughter. Emma, isn't it? His smile returned colder than before. I didn't realize you were in town. I heard you lived in Phoenix. Teacher, right? The casual display of knowledge about her life sent a chill down Emma's spine, but she maintained her composure. I go where I'm needed. Snake nodded slowly. Family loyalty, admirable. He turned back to Jim. Perhaps I was hasty with my initial offer. I'm authorized to go to 75,000. The price isn't the issue, Jim said firmly. This garage isn't for sale, not now, not ever. The tension in the room thickened. Snake's men shifted slightly, hands drifting closer to concealed weapons. Jim stood immobile, his expression betraying nothing of the tactical assessments running through his mind, counting threats, identifying exits, calculating response times. I admired the Cuban Missile Crisis, son. Jim said, his tone conversational but edged with steel. You don't scare me. Snake's eyebrows rose slightly at the unexpected reference. For a brief moment, professional respect flickered across his features. You know, Snake said, tucking the envelope away, most men your age are looking toward retirement, grandchildren, a quiet life. The threat underlying his words was unmistakable. I've never been most men, Jim replied simply. Snake nodded as if having confirmed something to himself. We'll be in touch, Mr. Carroll. The business landscape in Oak Ridge is changing rapidly. I'd hate to see a local institution like yours unable to adapt. With a final glance at Emma that lingered uncomfortably, Snake turned and walked out. His men mounted their bikes in the same choreographed precision with which they'd arrived. As the roar of motorcycles faded, Emma released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Well, that was subtle as a heart attack. Jim's eyes remained fixed on the empty doorway. They'll be back, with a less friendly approach. What did you mean about the Cuban Missile Crisis? Emma asked, curious about her father's odd reference. A ghost of a smile touched Jim's lips, just reminding him that old men have seen worse threats than him. He turned toward the office. Close up early today. We need to check something. After the last customer left, Emma systematically inspected the garage while Jim watched approvingly. Her movements were methodical, professional, starting with obvious places before moving to less conspicuous areas. Under the front counter, she found a small electronic device no larger than a matchbox. Listening device, she confirmed, showing it to Jim without touching it. Military grade. Jim nodded, unsurprised. Keep looking. By closing time, they had discovered 3 more, one in the office, one in the customer waiting area, and one magnetically attached to the underside of a workbench. They've been planning this, Emma said, carefully placing the devices in a metal box. These weren't installed today. No, Jim agreed. They've been watching, gathering intelligence. Like professionals, Emma added quietly. Jim studied his daughter, noting the way she had swept the building with practiced efficiency. Where did a high school teacher learn counter-surveillance techniques? Emma met his gaze steadily. Where did a small-town mechanic learn to recognize military-grade listening devices? The moment stretched between them, father and daughter, each aware the other harbored secrets, neither quite ready to fully reveal them. Finally, Jim sighed. I think it's time we had a talk, Emma, a real one. The Carroll family basement had always been off-limits to Emma's childhood friends. Dad's private workshop, she'd explained when questioned. Now, as Jim unlocked the heavy door at the bottom of the stairs, Emma realized just how private it truly was. The first room appeared innocent enough, a standard workshop with tools, a workbench, and shelves of mechanical parts. But Jim proceeded to a metal filing cabinet in the corner, unlocked it with a key from his personal ring, and removed what looked like an ordinary toolbox. Your mother never knew everything, Jim said quietly, placing the box on the workbench. I wanted to keep her safe. Ignorance was protection in those days. From the box, he removed a false bottom to reveal a small optical scanner. Jim placed his right eye against it. After a moment, a soft click signaled the release of a hidden mechanism. The entire back wall of shelving swung inward, revealing a room Emma had never known existed. Dad, she whispered, stunned despite her own secrets. The hidden room was approximately 15 by 20 feet, windowless and climate-controlled. One wall held communications equipment that looked sophisticated despite its obvious age. Another displayed maps of Latin America with locations marked in faded red. Filing cabinets lined a third wall, while weapons including several rifles Emma recognized as military issue were secured in a glass cabinet. CIA, Emma asked, though she already knew the answer. Jim nodded. Technical Operations Officer from 1975 to 1990. Officially, I was a mechanical consultant for American companies and expanding into Latin America. Mom thought you were on business trips. She did, and they were in a way. Jim moved to the filing cabinets and began searching through folders. For 15 years, I installed surveillance equipment, maintained vehicles, and provided technical support for operations throughout Latin America. Operations like Panama, Emma said. Operation Just Cause. Jim paused, looking at his daughter with newfound respect. You've done your research. When your husband is Special Forces, you learn to read between the lines of history, Emma replied. Especially when your father's stories about business trips never quite added up. Jim pulled out a thick file folder marked Snowcap, 1987, 1990, and laid it on a small table in the center of the room. Operation Snowcap was a joint DEA-CIA initiative targeting cocaine production and trafficking routes throughout Central and South America. Jim explained, opening the file to reveal photographs, maps, and operational reports. By 1990, we had expanded into Mexico, focusing on cartel routes into the southwestern United States. Emma studied the documents, her trained eye picking up details most civilians would miss. You weren't just technical support, she said, noting Jim's name on several operational briefings. You were in the field. When necessary, Jim conceded. My cover as a mechanic made me valuable for certain types of infiltration. I could go places other agents couldn't. Emma turned a page and froze. There, in a surveillance photograph labeled Nogales 1991, was a younger version of the man who had stood in their garage hours earlier. Snake, she breathed. Ray Harlow. Not exactly, Jim said grimly. That's Victor Harlow, Ray's father. Emma looked closer at the date and details. This was during a DEA operation. Jim nodded, his expression darkening with memory. Victor Harlow was a major distributor for the Sinaloa cartel. He used his legitimate import-export business as cover for moving cocaine across the border. Jim tapped the photo. This was taken 3 days before we raided his warehouse. We seized over 200 kilos of cocaine and arrested Victor. What happened to him? Emma asked, though something in her father's tone suggested she already knew. He hanged himself in his cell before trial, Jim said quietly. Left a wife and a son who was serving with the Navy SEALs at the time. Ray, Emma concluded. Snake. Yes. He received an emergency leave to attend his father's funeral. Jim closed the file. 6 months later, he was dishonorably discharged after a mission went bad in Nicaragua. Excessive force, civilian casualties. And now he's here, Emma said, the pieces falling into place. In Oak Ridge, where his father's case officer retired. Jim nodded gravely. It's not coincidence, Emma. He knows who I am. What I did. This isn't about your garage, Emma realized. It's about revenge. The garage is still valuable to their operation, Jim corrected. But yes, I suspect personal vengeance is a bonus for Snake. Emma paced the small room, processing the implications. Does Michael know about your past? No, Jim admitted, though I suspect he's had his suspicions. Hard to hide certain instincts from another operator. Emma stopped pacing and faced her father directly. Then it's time you knew about us, too. She took a deep breath. Michael isn't just Delta Force. He's been tracking the Desert Scorpions for months. They're part of a new smuggling network moving drugs from Mexico through small border towns. Jim showed no surprise at this revelation. I figured as much when you suddenly decided to visit. Michael sent you here to keep you safe and to keep an eye on things. He did, Emma confirmed. But now I wonder if he knew more than he told me. Jim moved to the communications equipment and powered up a secure terminal that looked like it belonged in a spy film from the previous decade. Let's find out what we're really dealing with. For the next 3 hours, father and daughter shared intelligence, filling in gaps in each other's knowledge. Emma revealed her training in counter-surveillance and self-defense standard for spouses of certain Delta operators who might become targets. Jim explained the network of former agents and operatives he still maintained contact with despite his official retirement. The picture that emerged was disturbing. The Desert Scorpions were more than a motorcycle gang. They were a sophisticated criminal organization with military discipline and tactics, moving drugs, weapons, and occasionally people across the increasingly porous border. Their operation in Oak Ridge was part of a larger network establishing footholds in small towns throughout the Southwest. I need to contact Michael, Emma said, finally checking her watch. He needs to know what we've discovered. Jim nodded, his expression grim. Use the equipment here. It's old but secure. He hesitated. Emma, there's something else you should know. She looked up, noting the sudden gravity in her father's tone. I'm dying, he said simply. Cancer, stage 4. The doctors gave me 6 months. That was 4 months ago. Emma stared at him, momentarily speechless. Why didn't you tell me? Because you'd have worried. Because you'd have felt obligated to come home earlier. Jim's eyes softened. Because I'm still trying to protect my little girl, even when she's grown into a woman who clearly doesn't need my protection anymore. Emma crossed the room and embraced her father, feeling the frailty in his frame that she'd attributed to age alone. How bad is the pain? Manageable most days, Jim said, returning the embrace before gently disengaging. I've refused the stronger medications. Need to keep my wits about me. Treatment options. At my age with this type of cancer, Jim shook his head. Might buy me a few more months of feeling terrible. I'd rather have fewer good days than more bad ones. Emma fought back tears, compartmentalizing her emotions with the discipline she'd learned from Michael. We'll discuss this more later, she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. Right now, we need to focus on the immediate threat. Jim smiled proudly at his daughter's resilience. You'd have made one hell of an operative, Emma. I learned from the best, she replied, turning to the secure communications terminal. Now let's call in some backup. The following days established a new rhythm at Carol's Auto Repair. On the surface, business continued as usual. Vehicles were serviced, customers came and went, and Jim and Emma maintained a facade of normalcy. Beneath this routine, however, father and daughter prepared for the confrontation they knew was coming. Jim led Emma through the garage's hidden defenses, features he'd incorporated during renovations after his retirement that suddenly made perfect sense. The reinforced back office with its steel core door, the hidden escape route through the parts storage area, most surprisingly a Prohibition-era tunnel in the basement that had once connected to a speakeasy 3 blocks away, now terminating in a maintenance shed behind an abandoned gas station. The previous owner was a bootlegger, Jim explained as they inspected the tunnel by flashlight. I discovered this during renovations and decided it might prove useful someday. Paranoia as a lifestyle choice. Emma teased, though she was impressed by her father's foresight. Jim's smile didn't reach his eyes. In my line of work, paranoia was survival. They established security protocols, installed additional cameras around the property, and maintained constant surveillance on Desert Scorpion's movements throughout Oak Ridge. Emma was disturbed by how quickly the gang had integrated into the town, purchasing properties, establishing relationships with local officials, and intimidating those who resisted their influence. Sheriff Hayes became a regular evening visitor, bringing updates on the deteriorating situation. Each night, his reports grew more concerning. Lost another deputy today, he reported one evening, declining Jim's offer of bourbon. Young Williams found him cleaning out his locker, said his mother was sick in Phoenix. Walter's weathered face conveyed his skepticism. Boy's mother died 3 years ago. How many does that leave you? Jim asked. Just Parker and Rodriguez. Both good men, but they're scared, Jim. The Scorpions have eyes everywhere. Emma, who had been silent during these exchanges, finally spoke up. They're isolating potential resistance. Classic insurgency tactics. Walter looked at her sharply. That's military thinking, Miss Emma. I read a lot, she replied smoothly. Walter didn't press, but his expression suggested he wasn't convinced. Whatever they're planning, it's coming soon. They've set up some kind of operation at the old McKinley warehouse. Trucks coming and going at all hours. We need help, Walter, Jim said. Real help, not just the 3 of us. The sheriff nodded grimly. The days of men with principles, standing up for what's right, seemed to be fading, Jim. But I made some calls anyway, to some of our mutual acquaintances. Emma glanced between the 2 older men, recognizing the subtext. Your old customers, Dad, the ones who always pay in cash and never need receipts. Jim's lips twitched in a suppressed mourn. Walter might have mentioned our situation to some of the boys who stop by when they're between contracts. Former military, Walter clarified, seeing Emma's questioning look. Men who served with honor and still remember what that means. Men who owe your father for various kindnesses over the years. How many? Emma asked, immediately thinking in tactical terms. 6 confirmed, Walter replied. Maybe more. They'll be here if we need them. As Walter departed, Emma followed her father to the back porch where they sat watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of crimson and gold. For several minutes, neither spoke, each lost in private thoughts about the coming storm. "I need to tell you something else," Jim finally said, his voice rough with emotion he rarely displayed. "About why I'm refusing treatment." Emma started to object, but Jim raised a hand to silence her. "It's not just about quality of life, though. That's part of it." He stared into the darkening landscape. "I've lived with regrets, Emma. Things I did, things I was part of. When you work in the shadows long enough, the lines between right and wrong start to blur." "Dad, let me finish." Jim turned to face his daughter, his eyes reflecting the last light of day. "Victor Harlow wasn't just another cartel associate. He was my informant. I recruited him, turned him against the Sinaloa cartel. For 2 years, he fed us information that saved lives and disrupted operations." Emma's expression betrayed her surprise. This detail hadn't been in any of the files. When the operation was compromised, choices had to be made. Assets burned. Jim's voice had gone flat the way it did when he was suppressing strong emotion. "Victor was sacrificed to protect the larger operation. I was the one who gave the order." "You were following protocol," Emma said softly. "I was," Jim agreed. "But protocol didn't have to face Victor's wife at his funeral. Protocol didn't have to see the hatred in his son's eyes." He sighed heavily. "I've made peace with most of my past, Emma, but that decision, that's the one I can't reconcile." "And now Snake is here for revenge," Emma concluded. "Now Snake is here and I have a chance to face the consequences of my actions directly." Jim reached for his daughter's hand. "I'm dying anyway, Emma. But if I can protect you, protect this town from what's coming, maybe I can make one last thing right before I go." Emma squeezed her father's hand, understanding with sudden clarity the burden he had carried silently for years. "You're not alone in this fight, Dad. Not anymore." Jim smiled faintly. "No, I suppose I'm not." His expression sobered. "Have you reached Michael?" "Yes," Emma confirmed. "He's arranging extraction from his current position. Said he could be here within 48 hours. Will it be soon enough?" Emma's expression hardened with determination. "It will have to be." As darkness settled over Oak Ridge, lights appeared on the distant highway, a convoy of vehicles moving toward town. The Desert Scorpions were bringing in reinforcements, preparing for whatever operation they had planned. In the Carroll home, father and daughter continued their own preparations, checking weapons, reviewing defensive positions, and planning for contingencies neither wanted to face. The coming days would test them both in ways they could scarcely imagine. The battle for Oak Ridge had begun. Dawn broke over Oak Ridge with an ominous crimson glow that painted the desert landscape in shades of fire. Emma Carroll stood on the porch of her father's home coffee mug, warming her hands against the morning chill, watching as the sun climbed above the distant mountains. Something in the air felt different, heavier, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. Her satellite phone vibrated in her pocket. Michael's encrypted message was brief but clear. "En route, 36 hours. Stay vigilant." 36 hours. Emma calculated silently. Too long if the Desert Scorpions accelerated their timeline. She would need to buy time, keep her father safe, gather intelligence. The tactical part of her mind, the part Michael had helped cultivate, was already formulating contingency plans. As she drove to the garage, Emma noticed subtle changes throughout Oak Ridge. More motorcycles parked outside the local diner. Unfamiliar men in leather vests lounging on street corners. Faces that turned to watch her pass eyes that lingered too long on her vehicle. The town was being infiltrated methodically and thoroughly. When she pulled into the garage parking lot, Emma's heart sank. During the night, someone had spray-painted a massive red scorpion across the front of Carol's auto repair. Beneath it, in jagged lettering, "Time's running out." She found Jim inside, calmly photographing the vandalism with an old Polaroid camera. "Insurance," he explained, though they both knew conventional insurance wouldn't protect them from what was coming. "They're getting bolder," Emma observed, running her fingers along a deep scratch in her father's office door, a new addition since yesterday. "They're establishing dominance," Jim corrected, his voice clinically detached. "Marking territory. It's psychological warfare." "Seems personal for just business," Emma noted. Jim's expression hardened. "For Snake, it's both. They spent the morning attempting normalcy, servicing vehicles, greeting customers, maintaining the facade of an ordinary repair shop. But beneath this routine, father and daughter were hyper-aware of every unusual sound, every unfamiliar face that passed by the garage. Just before noon, a sleek black SUV with government plates pulled into the lot. The man who emerged wore an impeccable suit despite the Arizona heat, tall, athletic, with the close-cropped hair and vigilant eyes of federal law enforcement. FBI, Emma murmured to Jim as they watched through the office window. The agent approached with practiced confidence, badge already extended. Mr. Carroll, Special Agent Daniel Foster, FBI, Phoenix Field Office. Jim wiped his hands on a shop rag before accepting the offered handshake. What brings the Bureau to Oak Ridge, Agent Foster? We're conducting an investigation into organized criminal activity along the border. Foster explained, his gaze sweeping the garage interior with professional assessment. Specifically a group calling themselves the Desert Scorpions. Never heard of them, Jim replied blandly. Foster's expression suggested he didn't believe this for a second. Mr. Carroll, we have reason to believe this organization has expressed interest in your property. Have you been approached about selling? Lots of people express interest in my garage. Jim shrugged. I'm not selling. Emma watched the exchange with growing unease. Something about Foster felt off, his timing too convenient, his questions too specific. In her experience with Michael's work, legitimate federal operations maintained strict compartmentalization. They didn't send solo agents to make casual inquiries. And you are, Foster turned his attention to Emma. Imama to Emma Davis, Jim's daughter. She deliberately omitted her connection to Michael. I'm helping out at the shop while I'm in town. From Phoenix, correct? You teach high school there. Foster's seemingly casual knowledge of her background confirmed Emma's suspicions. That's right, she replied evenly. History and civics. Foster nodded as if mentally filing away the information. Well, if either of you notices unusual activity or feels threatened in any way, please contact me. He handed Jim a business card. The Desert Scorpions are more dangerous than they appear. They're not just some motorcycle club. We'll keep that in mind, Jim said, pocketing the card without looking at it. After Foster departed, Emma and Jim exchanged a knowing glance. Definitely not FBI, Emma concluded. Not a chance, Jim agreed. Bureau agents don't operate solo in potential cartel territory, and they don't have that level of specific intelligence on civilians unless they've been conducting long-term surveillance. DEA, maybe, Emma suggested, or playing both sides. Wouldn't be the first time a federal agent got compromised, Jim said grimly. But my money's on Snake establishing how much we know, testing our reactions, which means they're watching us even more closely than we thought. That evening, Emma slipped away from the garage under the pretense of picking up dinner. Instead, she drove to the outskirts of town, where she parked on a ridge overlooking the old McKinley warehouse that Sheriff Hayes had identified as the Desert Scorpions' base of operations. Through high-powered binoculars, she observed the compound with methodical precision, mentally cataloging guard positions, vehicles, and patrol patterns. The warehouse was larger than she'd expected, a sprawling concrete structure built in the 1970s for agricultural storage, now surrounded by a hastily erected chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. Emma counted at least 15 motorcycles and several trucks. The level of activity suggested preparation for something significant. Men loading crates, vehicles being serviced, lookouts positioned at strategic points. She was about to leave when a familiar black SUV pulled into the compound. Agent Foster emerged immediately, greeted by two Scorpions who escorted him inside. Gotcha, Emma whispered, snapping several photos with a telephoto lens. As she prepared to depart, movement at the warehouse's main entrance caught her attention. Snake appeared deep in conversation with a man Emma hadn't seen before, shorter, with the compact build of a fighter and a distinctive limp. Something in his bearing triggered Emma's instincts. Unlike the other Scorpions, he moved with the controlled economy of someone professionally trained. The man glanced in Emma's direction, too far to see her, but the gesture itself was telling. He scanned the perimeter with the habitual vigilance of someone who expected to be watched. Emma lowered her binoculars and carefully backed away from her observation point. Time to go. Later that night, as Jim and Emma reviewed her surveillance photos, a soft knock at the back door interrupted their planning. Sheriff Hayes entered it, looking more haggard than usual. Got something, he said without preamble, placing a folded paper on the kitchen table. Names and addresses of everyone in Oak Ridge who's been approached to sell property in the last 3 months. Jim studied the list. This is half the commercial real estate in town, Walter. And most have sold or are considering offers, Hayes confirmed grimly. Desert Scorpions are using shell companies, but it's them behind every purchase. They're buying up Oak Ridge piece by piece. They're establishing a distribution hub, Emma realized. Warehouses for storage businesses, for fronts, residential properties for personnel. Turning the whole town into a cartel operation, Jim agreed. But why Oak Ridge? There are dozens of similar towns along the border. Sheriff Hayes shifted uncomfortably. There's something else. Rodriguez, my deputy, overheard something at the diner today. The Scorpions are expecting a major shipment tomorrow night. Jim and Emma exchanged concerned glances. What kind of shipment? Jim asked. Didn't hear specifics, Hayes replied, but they're clearing the entire warehouse for it. Whatever it is, it's big. After Hayes departed, Emma sent another encrypted message to Michael updating him on the accelerated timeline. His response was immediate and concerning. Delay them if possible, ETA still 24+ hours. We need more information, Jim stated, studying satellite imagery of the warehouse on his secure terminal. And we need to know who that limping man is. I'll go back tomorrow, Emma decided. Daylight reconnaissance. Maybe I can get closer. Too dangerous, Jim objected. Emma met her father's gaze steadily. More dangerous than letting them proceed unchecked until Michael arrives. Jim had no answer for that. The next morning brought a development neither had anticipated. Emma's Jeep parked in the garage lot had been vandalized during the night. Tires slashed, windshield shattered, and a dead scorpion pinned to the driver's seat with a hunting knife. Jim photographed the damage while Emma searched for surveillance cameras that might have captured the perpetrators. She found none. All cameras in the vicinity had been disabled or repositioned. Message received, Emma said tightly, carefully removing the scorpion with a pair of pliers. This isn't just intimidation anymore, Jim observed. They're escalating to direct threats. Emma nodded grimly. And I don't think it's coincidence that they targeted my vehicle right after I conducted surveillance. You were spotted? Maybe. Emma frowned, remembering the limping man's vigilant scanning of the perimeter. Or they have better counter-surveillance than we anticipated. Inside the garage office, they found 3 messages on the answering machine, all from potential buyers expressing interest in the property, each offering more than the last. The final call was from Snake himself, his cultured voice incongruously polite, as he suggested a final discussion about the future of Carol's auto repair. As Emma listened to the messages, a reflection in the window caught her attention, a glint of metal from the rooftop across the street. She casually adjusted her position, using the window glass to observe without being obvious. A man with a telephoto lens was photographing the garage. We're being watched, she said quietly to Jim. Roof across the street. Jim didn't turn or react, continuing to sort through paperwork as if nothing were amiss. Gathering intelligence for their next move, he murmured. Or documenting our routines for an attack, Emma added. The morning passed with excruciating slowness. Each customer scrutinized as a potential threat, each passing vehicle assessed for danger. By noon, Emma's nerves were stretched taut as piano wire, her body humming with the hypervigilance that comes from prolonged threat awareness. When her satellite phone vibrated with an incoming message, she nearly jumped. The text from Michael was cryptic, but alarming. Compromise and asset in Scorpions. Identity unknown. Extreme caution. Emma showed the message to Jim, whose expression darkened. Someone on the inside was working with Michael, he translated, feeding him intelligence. But they've been made. Which means Snake knows he's being investigated, Emma concluded, and possibly knows about Michael's connection to me. We need to accelerate our timeline, Jim decided. If they know about Michael, they might move against us before he can get here. Emma nodded agreement. I'll contact our reinforcements. Using Sheriff Hayes as an intermediary, Emma arranged for Jim's former military contacts to convene at an abandoned ranch house 5 miles outside town. By dusk, 6 men had assembled, each hardened by conflicts most Americans only read about, each owing Jim Carroll debts of various kinds. Among them was Carter Reynolds, a former Army Ranger sniper, who now worked private security contracts. Mason Briggs, whose expertise in demolitions had served multiple 3-letter agencies. Hector Ramirez, whose 20 years in special forces had left him with an encyclopedic knowledge of tactical operations, and 3 others with similarly specialized backgrounds. "Gentlemen," Jim greeted them, his manner shifting subtly into that of a commander rather than a mechanic. "Thank you for coming." "You saved my life in Honduras, Jim," Reynolds replied simply. "Consider this interest on an old debt." Emma observed the men with professional assessment. All were in their 50s or early 60s, past their physical prime perhaps, but with the compensating advantages of experience and judgment. The kind of men who survived decades in the world's most dangerous places weren't to be underestimated regardless of age. She laid out the situation: the Desert Scorpions' takeover of Oak Ridge, their drug trafficking operation, the mysterious shipment expected that night, and the personal vendetta against Jim. "My husband is Delta Force," she added, noting but ignoring the raised eyebrows this revelation caused. "He's been tracking the Scorpions as part of a larger investigation into cartel activity. He's en route but won't arrive for at least 24 hours. And you need us to buy time," Briggs concluded. "Intelligence first," Jim corrected. "We need to know exactly what's coming into that warehouse tonight. Then we can determine how to disrupt their operation until reinforcements arrive." The men exchanged glances, a silent communication born of shared experiences. "Surveillance teams of 2, Reynolds suggested. 3 observation points around the warehouse. Radio communication only in emergencies, otherwise we rendezvous back here at 0200 hours. "I've got equipment in my truck," Ramirez added. "Night vision directional mics, the works." As the men geared up, Emma pulled Jim aside. "I'm going with Reynolds." She stated, her tone making it clear this wasn't a request. Jim studied his daughter for a long moment. "He's the best," he finally acknowledged. "Stay close to him." While the surveillance teams departed, Jim and Sheriff Hayes remained at the ranch house, coordinating communications and planning contingencies. Just before Emma left, Jim took her hand, pressing something cold and metal into her palm. "Your mother's locket," he explained softly. "She'd want you to have it, for luck." Emma closed her fingers around the heirloom, recognizing the gesture for what it was, a father's fear that this might be goodbye. "I'll see you at 0200, she said firmly. Darkness had settled completely over the desert as Emma and Reynolds took position on a rocky outcropping a half-mile from the warehouse. Through night vision scopes, they watched as activity at the compound intensified. More guards increased patrols, vehicles being moved to create an open space in the center of the property. "They're expecting something big," Reynolds whispered, adjusting the focus on his scope. "Look at the security positioning, overlapping fields of fire-elevated observation posts. These aren't just bikers. They've had professional training." Emma nodded agreement, noting details that confirmed her own assessment: the disciplined patrol routes, the tactical spacing between guards, the absence of casual conversation or smoking that would typically occur during a nighttime watch. At precisely 11:30 p.m., headlights appeared on the distant highway, a convoy of 3 semi-trucks approaching the warehouse compound. "Showtime," Reynolds murmured, activating a small recording device. The trucks entered the compound with practiced precision, backing into the warehouse loading docks in sequence. The massive bay doors closed behind the first truck before the second was permitted to enter, a security protocol that prevented any outside observation of the unloading process. "Smart," Emma commented. "They're compartmentalizing. No single observer can see the entire operation." "Military procedure," Reynolds agreed. "Whoever's running their security knows what they're doing." An hour passed as the trucks were unloaded inside the warehouse. Through their scopes, Emma and Reynolds could see only fragments of the operation crates being moved, men carrying what appeared to be wrapped packages, weapons prominently displayed. Then a disturbance near the main gate caught their attention. 2 Scorpions were dragging a struggling man toward the warehouse, a man with a distinctive limp. "That's him," Emma breathed, "the one I spotted yesterday." They watched as Snake emerged from the warehouse, confronting the captured man with cold fury, evident even at this distance. Words were exchanged, followed by a brutal blow that sent the limping man to his knees. "Your compromised asset," Reynolds guessed. "Looks like they found Michael's informant." Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night. If the Scorpions had identified Michael's inside source, they might already know about his connection to her, and by extension to Jim. "We need to warn my father," she said urgently. Reynolds hesitated, weighing operational security against the new threat. "Direct communication is too risky. We stick to the plan, rendezvous at 0200. Emma reluctantly agreed, but every instinct screamed that the timeline had accelerated dramatically. As they watched, the limping man was dragged into the warehouse, his fate all too easy to imagine. "Movement at the south entrance," Reynolds suddenly whispered. Emma shifted her scope to see Snake emerging from the warehouse, now deep in conversation with Agent Foster. The false FBI agent was gesturing emphatically, pointing toward town, toward Carol's auto repair. "They're coming for us," Emma realized. "Now." Reynolds was already packing up their surveillance equipment. "We need to move. Now." They descended the rocky outcropping as quickly as safety allowed, making their way to the hidden jeep that had brought them to the observation point. Reynolds drove with lights off, using night vision goggles to navigate the desert terrain back toward Oak Ridge. "Try your father again," he instructed, as they bounced over the rugged landscape. Emma's call to Jim's satellite phone went unanswered, as did her attempts to reach Sheriff Hayes and the other surveillance teams. "Communications blackout," Reynolds concluded grimly. "They're jamming signals in the area." "How?" Emma demanded. "That's military-grade capability." "Exactly," Reynolds replied. "Further confirmation that these aren't just ordinary criminals." As they crested a rise overlooking Oak Ridge, the reason for the communications failure became horrifyingly clear. Flashing emergency lights illuminated the pre-dawn darkness at the edge of town, where Carol's auto repair was located. "No." Emma breathed her worst fears, crystallizing as they drew closer. Fire trucks surrounded the garage, water streaming onto the burning structure as flames licked skyward from what had once been the Carroll family business. Even from a distance, Emma could see the building was beyond saving, the conflagration too intense, too complete to be accidental. "Jim," Reynolds murmured, genuine grief in his voice. "Good God, I hope he wasn't inside." Emma's training took over, suppressing the emotional response that threatened to overwhelm her. "Dad would have gone to the fallback position," she stated with more confidence than she felt. "The basement shelter at the house." Reynolds nodded, but his expression betrayed doubt. "We need to approach carefully. If they hit the garage, they might be watching the house too." They abandoned the jeep a mile from town, continuing on foot through backyards and alleyways to avoid main streets where scorpions might be patrolling. Dawn was breaking as they finally approached the Carroll residence from the rear property line, using a drainage ditch for cover. The house appeared untouched, no vehicles visible in the driveway or street. Emma led Reynolds to a cellar entrance concealed beneath a garden shed, an access point to the basement that Jim had shown her during their preparations. The door was unlocked, a promising sign that Jim might have used this route. Emma descended, first weapon drawn, Reynolds covering her back as they entered the basement. "Dad?" Emma called softly into the darkness. No response. Reynolds found a light switch illuminating the workshop area, empty, but with signs of recent activity. The door to Jim's secure room stood open, the communications equipment inside dark and silent. "Someone left in a hurry," Reynolds observed, noting scattered papers in an open weapons locker. Emma moved methodically through the space, searching for clues to her father's whereabouts. On the central table, she found a hastily scrawled note in Jim's handwriting. "Emma, compromised. S knows everything. Going to secondary location with WH. Wait for M. Do not attempt contact. J. WH is Walter Hayes," Emma explained to Reynolds. "They evacuated to the secondary location, probably the hunting cabin Sheriff Hayes keeps in the Superstition Mountains." Reynolds nodded. "Smart. Defensible position, limited access routes, good visibility." A sudden noise from upstairs froze them both. The unmistakable sound of the front door opening, followed by heavy footsteps on the main floor. Emma extinguished the light as Reynolds moved to a position covering the basement stairs, his weapon trained on the door at the top. Muffled voices filtered down, at least 3 men moving through the house with the systematic precision of a search team. Occasional phrases were audible. "Check the bedrooms," and "must be here somewhere." Emma and Reynolds exchanged glances in the darkness, a silent communication passing between them. They were trapped in the basement with unknown numbers above their only exit, potentially compromised if the searchers found the cellar entrance. Reynolds pointed to the tunnel entrance Jim had shown Emma days earlier, the Prohibition-era passage that led from the basement to an abandoned gas station 3 blocks away. Emma nodded, understanding. It was their best chance of escape. As they quietly gathered essential supplies from Jim's secure room, a thunderous crash echoed from upstairs, the sound of furniture being overturned or doors being broken down. The search was becoming more aggressive. "They're looking for something specific," Reynolds whispered as they prepared to enter the tunnel. Emma nodded grimly. "Or someone." The tunnel was narrow and low-ceilinged, forcing them to move in a crouched position through darkness, relieved only by the dim beam of Reynolds' tactical flashlight. Decades of disuse had left the passage filled with cobwebs and occasional debris, but the structure remained sound, a testament to the Prohibition-era builders who had created this escape route for bootleggers fleeing federal agents. After what seemed an eternity of silent progress, they reached the tunnel's end, a rusted metal door that opened into the storage room of an abandoned gas station. Reynolds went first, ensuring the building was clear before signaling Emma to follow. The gas station had been closed for years, its windows boarded, pumps long removed, only the faded sign above, suggesting its former purpose. Through gaps in the boarded windows, they could see Oak Ridge awakening to a changed reality. Desert scorpions now openly patrolling streets, residents hurrying about with downcast eyes, avoiding contact with the leather-clad enforcers who had seized control of their town overnight. Coup d'etat, Reynolds murmured. They've taken over completely. Emma checked her satellite phone again, still no signal. The jamming continued, isolating Oak Ridge from outside communication. We need transportation, she decided, and we need to reach my father's secondary location. The Scorpions will be watching all roads out of town, Reynolds cautioned. Then we don't use roads, Emma replied with grim determination. By mid-morning, they had acquired what they needed, an aging dirt bike borrowed from a storage shed behind a residence near the town limits, extra fuel, water, and basic supplies. Reynolds hotwired the motorcycle while Emma created a rough map to Sheriff Hayes' cabin, using her knowledge of local geography. It's about 40 miles, she estimated. Mostly off-road. We can make it by afternoon if we push. Reynolds nodded approval. After that, we formulate a proper counterattack. With your father, Hayes, and the others, we'll have enough manpower to hit the Scorpions before they realize we've regrouped. As Emma prepared to leave, a flicker of movement across the street caught her attention, a Desert Scorpion motorcycle slowly cruising past its rider, scanning buildings with methodical attention. They're still searching, she whispered, ducking back from the window. For you specifically, I'd wager, Reynolds replied. Your valuable leverage against both your father and your husband. The implication was clear. Emma had become a primary target. The Scorpions would be hunting her specifically, knowing her capture would draw both Jim and Michael into the open. We move at noon, Reynolds decided, when the shift change occurs at their checkpoints. I observed their rotation schedule during surveillance. They're predictable, at least in that regard. As they waited for the appointed time, Emma found her thoughts turning to Michael, now less than 24 hours away, according to his last message, but completely unaware of how drastically the situation had deteriorated. Would he arrive to find her captured, her father dead? The town completely under hostile control. At precisely noon, Reynolds confirmed the checkpoint rotation was underway, creating a brief window of reduced surveillance at the town's eastern boundary. They mounted the dirt bike, Reynolds driving Emma behind him, and accelerated away from the abandoned gas station, keeping to back alleys until they reached the desert beyond Oak Ridge's limits. Once clear of buildings, Reynolds opened the throttle fully, the bike bouncing over rough terrain as they headed east toward the distant mountains. Behind them, Oak Ridge receded into the heat haze, now a town under occupation. They had traveled perhaps 10 miles when Emma, glancing back, spotted dust clouds on the horizon, multiple vehicles in pursuit. "Company!" she shouted over the engine's roar, pointing behind them. Reynolds nodded acknowledgement without slowing. Expected, hold tight. He veered sharply off their planned route, heading toward a region of broken terrain where narrow canyons and dried creek beds created a natural maze terrain that would favor their small, maneuverable dirt bike over the larger vehicles pursuing them. For the next hour, Reynolds demonstrated why he had survived decades in the world's most dangerous regions, using every trick of off-road evasion to shake their pursuers. They crossed and recrossed the same creek beds, doubled back along their own tracks, and used rocky outcroppings to conceal their passage. By early afternoon, they had lost the immediate pursuit, but the dirt bike's fuel gauge was approaching empty, the price of their high-speed evasion. We need to conserve what's left, Reynolds decided as they paused in the shadow of a sandstone formation. 5 miles walking distance to the cabin by my estimate. They cached the dirt bike in a dry creek bed, covering it with brush to prevent reflection from its metal surfaces, and continued on foot through increasingly rugged terrain. The summer heat was merciless, the sun beating down with an intensity that seemed almost personal in its malevolence. Your father chose well, Reynolds commented as they hiked. This approach is naturally defensible. Limited lines of sight for potential attackers, multiple choke points where a few defenders could hold off superior numbers. Emma nodded, conserving her energy for the climb ahead. The terrain had shifted from desert flatlands to the rocky foothills of the Superstition Mountains, a region steeped in local legend and avoided by most due to its treacherous nature. By late afternoon, they had reached the approach to Sheriff Hayes's cabin, a natural clearing surrounded by pine trees offering limited visibility until one was almost upon the structure itself. Reynolds signaled for caution, drawing Emma behind a large boulder as they surveyed the area for any sign of activity. The cabin appeared peaceful, smoke rising from the chimney, suggesting occupancy, but no vehicles visible, no movement around the perimeter. Could be a trap, Reynolds warned. We approach from multiple angles. Recognition signal first. Using a small signal mirror, Reynolds flashed a prearranged pattern toward the cabin. 3 short flashes, 2 long, 3 short again. Old school communication, but effective. After a tense moment, an answering flash came from one of the cabin windows, the countersign they had established with Jim's group. Friendlies, Reynolds confirmed, visible relief in his expression. They emerged from cover and approached the cabin, directly, still maintaining vigilance, until the door opened and Sheriff Hayes stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, but pointed downward in the universal sign of cautious welcome. Took you long enough, Hayes called, the gruffness of his tone belied by the relief in his eyes. We were about to send out a search party. Emma rushed forward. My father? Hayes nodded toward the interior. Inside, he's okay, Emma. The reunion between father and daughter was brief but emotional. Jim embracing Emma with fierce protectiveness before reverting to the operational focus that decades of training had ingrained. Reynolds, Jim nodded to his old colleague. Good to see you made it. Nearly didn't, Reynolds replied grimly. The Scorpions have completely taken over Oak Ridge. Roadblocks, patrols, communications blackout. It's a military-style occupation. Jim's expression darkened. We've been monitoring as best we can with limited equipment. It's worse than we anticipated. Inside the rustic cabin, Emma found the rest of their impromptu resistance, Briggs, Ramirez, and the others from the surveillance operation, all having made their way to the rendezvous point through various means. Maps and improvised tactical diagrams covered a rough-hewn table in the center of the main room, surrounded by weapons and communications equipment salvaged from Jim's garage before the fire. What's the situation with the shipment? Emma asked immediately. Ramirez gestured to a series of photographs pinned to a corkboard. We managed to document part of the unloading process before communications went dark. Best we can tell, it was a major drug shipment, cocaine primarily based on packaging and handling procedures. But that's not all, Jim added gravely. They also received weapons, military grade. We're talking assault rifles, explosives, possibly even heavier ordnance. They're fortifying Oak Ridge, Reynolds concluded, turning it into a forward operating base for something bigger. Emma absorbed this information with growing concern. What about Michael's informant, the man with the limp? The men exchanged grim glances before Sheriff Hayes answered. Carlos Mendez, former DEA agent who went undercover in the Scorpions months ago. They discovered his identity yesterday. Is he alive? Emma pressed. Unknown, Hayes replied. But given Snake's methods, I wouldn't be optimistic. Emma updated the group on Michael's ETA, now less than 18 hours, and the likelihood that the Scorpions were aware of his connection to her and Jim. They'll be expecting him, Jim noted, probably setting up ambush points along all approach routes. Which means we need to create a diversion, Reynolds suggested, something to draw their attention away from Michael's ingress. The group fell into the familiar rhythm of operational planning, assessing assets, identifying vulnerabilities, establishing communication protocols for the limited equipment available. Despite their age and civilian status, these men reverted to their military training with the ease of donning a familiar garment, the years falling away as they focused on the tactical challenge before them. Emma watched her father during this process, noting the transformation that had occurred. Jim Carroll, the mechanic, had vanished completely, replaced by the CIA operative he had once been: decisive, analytical, strategic. Even his physical pain seemed temporarily forgotten as he directed the planning session with natural authority. By evening, they had established a tentative plan, a series of diversionary actions to begin the following night, coinciding with Michael's expected arrival, designed to divide the Scorpions' attention and resources. As darkness fell over the mountains, the group dispersed to various assignments, watch rotations, equipment preparation, rest periods, for those who would need their strength in the coming hours. Emma found her father alone on the cabin's rear deck, gazing at the distant lights of Oak Ridge visible through the trees. "You should rest," she said, joining him at the railing. Jim shook his head slightly. "Too much to do." "The pain's worse, isn't it?" Emma observed, noting the tightness around her father's eyes. "Manageable," Jim replied, the standard answer he gave to all inquiries about his condition. Emma didn't press. Instead, she asked the question that had been troubling her since their reunion. Why did Snake accelerate his timeline? What changed? Jim was silent for a long moment before answering. Mendez Michael's informant wasn't just gathering intelligence on the Scorpion's drug operation. He discovered something bigger. Jim turned to face his daughter directly. Snake is expecting someone tomorrow night. Someone important. Who? A cartel representative, high level, coming to inspect the new operation in Oak Ridge and authorize the next phase. Emma absorbed this information. That's why they moved so aggressively. They needed to secure the town before this visit. Exactly. And it's why they're hunting for us so intently. They can't have any loose ends or potential threats when their VIP arrives. The implications were clear. The situation was even more volatile than they had realized. The Desert Scorpions would be operating at heightened alert with reinforcements and increased security throughout Oak Ridge. "We need to warn Michael," Emma said, reaching for her satellite phone. Jim placed a restraining hand on her arm. "We can't risk it. Any transmission might be intercepted. The jamming isn't continuous. They're monitoring for outgoing communications." Emma reluctantly acknowledged the logic, but hated the thought of Michael walking into a situation even more dangerous than he anticipated. "Get some rest," Jim advised again, more gently this time. "Tomorrow will test us all." As Emma turned to go inside, a distant sound caught her attention, the distinctive thrum of motorcycle engines, faint but unmistakable in the quiet mountain air. Jim had heard it too, his posture instantly alert. "They've found us." Inside the cabin, the alarm spread quickly. Lights were extinguished, weapons distributed, defensive positions established with the swift efficiency of men who had done this many times before. Sheriff Hayes joined Jim and Emma at a window overlooking the approach path. "How many?" he asked tersely. "Hard to tell from the engine sounds," Jim replied. "At least 6 motorcycles. Maybe more." "Advanced scouting party." Reynolds assessed, checking the magazine in his rifle. "If they've found us more, we'll follow." Emma's tactical mind raced through options. The cabin was defensible, but ultimately a fixed position that could be surrounded and overwhelmed by superior numbers. Their best chance was to engage the initial force, then relocate before reinforcements arrived. "We need to capture one for interrogation," she suggested. "Find out how they located us and what their orders are." Jim nodded approval. Briggs Ramirez set up a choke point on the access road. "Aim for their bikes, not the riders if possible. We need at least one of them functional enough to talk." As the group moved into pre-assigned defensive positions, Jim pulled Emma aside. "If this goes badly, there's an escape tunnel beneath the woodshed out back. Hayes built it as a precaution years ago. It leads to a ravine about half a mile east." "I'm not leaving without you," Emma stated flatly. "This isn't negotiable," Jim replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "If I give the order, you go. Michael needs to know what's happening here." Before Emma could protest further, the first motorcycle headlights appeared on the winding access road below a staggered formation of riders approaching with caution. "Hold fire until they reach the choke point," Jim ordered over their short-range radio network. "Confirm targets before engaging." Emma positioned herself at a side window rifle braced against the weathered wooden frame, controlling her breathing as Michael had taught her during countless range sessions. Through her scope, she counted 8 motorcycles, likely the entire complement of a Scorpion reconnaissance team. The lead rider suddenly halted, causing the others to stop in a cascade of brake lights. Something had alerted them, perhaps an instinctive awareness of the ambush ahead, or a glimpse of movement where none should be. The moment of hesitation was brief but telling. These weren't ordinary gang members out for intimidation. They were disciplined, cautious, and tactically aware. "They sense it," Reynolds whispered from his position nearby. "Get ready." The lead Scorpion raised a hand signal to the others, who immediately began to deploy into an offensive formation, spreading out to minimize their vulnerability as a group using the limited cover available on the narrow mountain road. "They're initiating an attack," Jim assessed. "Defensive fire only. Remember, we need one alive." What followed was a precisely executed ambush defense. As the Scorpions advanced, Briggs triggered the prepared choke point, a deadfall of logs and rocks that blocked the road and disabled 3 motorcycles instantly. The remaining riders scattered for cover, returning fire toward the cabin with military-grade weapons. The exchange was brief but intense, controlled bursts from the defenders met with increasingly desperate fire from the attackers, who found themselves in exposed positions against an entrenched enemy with superior tactical positioning. Within minutes, the outcome was decided. 3 Scorpions lay dead, 2 wounded, the others pinned down with no avenue of retreat. When Sheriff Hayes called for their surrender, the survivors had little choice but to comply. As Ramirez and Briggs secured the prisoners, Jim and Emma assessed the situation. The victory had been complete, but would be short-lived. These men were only the advance team. Their failure to return would trigger a larger response. "We need to relocate," Jim decided. "Immediately. They'll have reported our position before attacking." The wounded prisoners were treated with field medical care, then interrogated with the efficient, no-nonsense approach of men accustomed to extracting information under pressure. The intelligence gathered was troubling, but valuable. The Scorpions had tracked Emma and Reynolds using thermal imaging equipment, military technology, that should have been beyond the reach of even a well-funded criminal organization. They had orders to capture Emma alive if possible, to kill Jim and the others regardless of resistance. Most concerning was the confirmation of Jim's information. A high-level cartel representative was indeed expected in Oak Ridge the following night, arriving by private plane at a makeshift airstrip the Scorpions had prepared outside town. "That's our leverage," Jim realized. "If we can disrupt this meeting, we deal a significant blow to their entire operation." Emma nodded agreement, already formulating approaches. "But first, we need to relocate and establish contact with Michael. He needs to know everything we've learned." As the group prepared to abandon the cabin, gathering essential supplies and ensuring no evidence of their plans remained, Emma found herself drawn back to the deck where she and Jim had spoken earlier. The lights of Oak Ridge still glimmered in the distance, a town she had known all her life, now under the control of men who would destroy everything in pursuit of profit and power. Tomorrow would bring Michael, her husband, the Delta Force operator who had faced death in a dozen countries. Tomorrow would bring confrontation with Snake and his cartel allies. Tomorrow would determine whether Oak Ridge remained under occupation or began the process of reclamation. But before tomorrow came, they would need to survive the night, a night of movement through dangerous terrain, pursued by men with resources and determination that made them formidable enemies. Emma touched her mother's locket, still secure around her neck, drawing strength from the connection to her past, even as she prepared for an uncertain future. "Ready?" Jim asked, appearing in the doorway behind her. Emma nodded, her expression resolute. "Let's go get our town back." As they slipped away from the cabin into the darkness of the Superstition Mountains, Emma's thoughts turned to Michael, hoping he would be prepared for what awaited him in Oak Ridge, and praying they would both survive to see the morning after tomorrow. The abandoned silver mine had been operational until the 1950s, its tunnels burrowing deep into the eastern slope of the Superstition Mountains like arteries into living rock. Now it served as the fallback position for Jim Carroll's improvised resistance, a maze of reinforced passages and chambers invisible from the air, and accessible only through a single entrance concealed by decades of natural overgrowth. Emma checked her satellite phone for the dozenth time that morning. Still no signal. The Desert Scorpion's communications jamming had expanded beyond Oak Ridge to encompass the surrounding wilderness, isolating them completely from outside contact. Michael was due to arrive within hours, but with no way to warn him of the escalated situation, he would be entering a trap. "Anything?" Jim asked, approaching with 2 steaming cups of coffee brewed over the small camp stove they'd salvaged from Sheriff Hayes' cabin. Emma shook her head, accepting the mug gratefully. "Nothing. They've extended the jamming radius to at least 15 miles from town." Jim settled beside her at the mine entrance, where a narrow opening provided a commanding view of the valley below and the distant outskirts of Oak Ridge. Through binoculars, they could see increased activity, vehicles moving along highways, motorcycles patrolling outlying areas, the occasional glint of light from surveillance positions. "They're anticipating Michael," Jim observed. "They know Delta Force operators don't abandon family." "Which means they'll be watching all approach routes," Emma added grimly. Jim nodded agreement. "The question is, how much do they know about Michael specifically, his tactics, his training?" "Snake was Navy SEAL," Emma reminded him. Different branch, different methodologies, but he'd understand the basic approach. The sound of boots on stone announced Reynolds' arrival. The former ranger had assumed the role of tactical coordinator, his decades of experience providing a steady counterbalance to Jim's strategic planning. "Recon team is back," Reynolds reported without preamble. "Situation in town is deteriorating. The Scorpions have rounded up anyone they consider a potential threat, former military law enforcement, even the high school wrestling coach. They're being held at the community center. Hostages," Jim concluded. "Insurance against outside intervention." "There's more," Reynolds continued. "They've established a defensive perimeter around the old McKinley airstrip north of town. Heavy security, including mounted weapons and what appears to be anti-aircraft capability." Emma and Jim exchanged concerned glances. Such defenses were far beyond typical cartel resources. "Whoever's flying in tonight is high value," Jim stated. "Cartel leadership," Emma agreed. "Someone worth protecting at all costs." "Or someone with their own security requirements," Reynolds suggested. "The setup reminds me of diplomatic security protocols I've seen in conflict zones." The implications hung in the air between them. If Reynolds was right, they were facing an operation with potential connections beyond just drug cartels, possibly involving corrupt officials or even foreign interests. Inside the main chamber of the mine, the rest of their group had gathered around the makeshift tactical table, a flat boulder covered with maps and diagrams illuminated by battery-powered lanterns. Sheriff Hayes pointed to positions marked on a topographic map of the region. "Scorpions have checkpoints here, here, and here," he indicated. "Main force concentrated at the warehouse and the airstrip. Smaller teams patrolling outlying areas, including the foothills where we are now." "They're spreading themselves thin," observed Briggs, the demolitions expert. "Even with the reinforcements that arrived yesterday, they can't maintain this level of coverage indefinitely." "They don't need to," Jim replied. "Just until tonight's meeting concludes." The group fell silent, considering the challenge before them. With limited personnel, weapons, and communications, they faced an entrenched force with superior numbers and resources. "We need Michael," Emma stated what they all knew, "but we also need to ensure he doesn't walk into an ambush." "Then we create a diversion," Jim decided. "Something big enough to draw their attention away from the most likely approach routes." Reynolds nodded approval. "Hit them where they're vulnerable, force them to reallocate resources." For the next hour, the group developed their plan, a series of coordinated strikes designed to create maximum confusion with minimum risk. Briggs would target the Scorpions' fuel depot on the edge of town. Ramirez and his team would disable communications equipment at strategic locations. Sheriff Hayes would lead an effort to free the hostages, while Reynolds established a sniper position overlooking the airstrip. As the others prepared equipment and reviewed assignments, Emma pulled her father aside. "What about us?" she asked. "Where will we be during all this?" Jim's expression was grave. "We'll be creating the primary diversion. Something personal enough that Snake won't be able to ignore it." "You're going to offer yourself as bait," Emma realized, not bothering to hide her dismay. "More like announcing my presence in a way that demands response," Jim corrected. "Snake wants revenge against me. His focus on that vendetta is a weakness we can exploit." "It's too dangerous," Emma objected. "Your condition is precisely why this makes sense," Jim interrupted gently. "My time is limited regardless, Emma, but I can choose how to use what remains." Emma studied her father's face, the lines etched by pain and determination, the steel in his eyes that decades of peaceful living had never entirely erased. She recognized the resolve of a man who had made peace with his decision. "Then I'm with you," she stated firmly. "All the way." Jim shook his head. "Your job is to find Michael, guide him in. He's the game changer in this scenario. And if we can't make contact, if the jamming prevents us from finding each other," Jim smiled faintly, "you're his wife. He'll find you." As afternoon lengthened toward evening, the resistance fighters made their final preparations. Weapons were checked and rechecked. Communication protocols established using the limited short-range radios they had available. Extraction routes and rendezvous points committed to memory. Emma observed it all with the analytical eyes she'd developed through her relationship with Michael, noting the professionalism of these aging warriors as they prepared once more for combat. Despite their years, each moved with the purpose and focus of men half their age, muscle memory, overriding the limitations of aging bodies. Jim approached as she was checking her own equipment, A tactical vest over desert camouflage pistol secured in a thigh holster knife sheathed at her ankle. "Your mother would be proud," he said quietly, "and terrified." Emma managed a smile. "I think she always knew I wasn't destined for a completely normal life, even before I met Michael." Catherine had remarkable insight. Jim agreed, his expression softening at the memory of his wife. "She once told me you had my stubbornness and her common sense. God help whoever gets in her way," she said. For a brief moment, the weight of their situation lifted as father and daughter shared a connection to the woman who had loved them both, a presence still felt despite the years since her passing. The moment ended as Reynolds approached, his expression grim. Movement on the Eastern Access Road, vehicle approaching fast, military driving pattern. Emma's heart leapt. "Michael." "Unknown," Reynolds replied cautiously. "But it's definitely someone with tactical training. Evasive routing, varied speeds, checkpoint avoidance." The group moved to defensive positions, weapons ready, but held in reserve until identification could be confirmed. Emma positioned herself where she could observe the approaching vehicle, now visible as a dust cloud moving rapidly along a rarely used Forest Service road. Through binoculars, she caught glimpses of a nondescript SUV navigating the rugged terrain with expert precision, occasionally disappearing from view before reappearing on a different approach vector. The driving pattern was familiar, a technique for evading surveillance that Michael had demonstrated during one of their weekend excursions into the Sonoran Desert. "It's him," she breathed, recognition flooding through her. "That's Michael's driving signature." Jim signaled the others to maintain their positions while Emma moved to the agreed rendezvous point, a clearing visible from the mine entrance, but concealed from aerial observation by the natural rock formations that characterize the region. The SUV halted 100 yards from the clearing, the driver clearly conducting a final security assessment before committing to the approach. After a tense moment, the vehicle continued forward, stopping just short of the open area. The driver's door opened slowly, deliberately. A man emerged, tall, athletically built, dressed in civilian clothing that nonetheless failed to conceal his military bearing. He surveyed the surroundings with methodical precision, one hand resting near the concealed weapon at his waist. Michael Davis had arrived. Emma stepped into the clearing, hands visible, using the recognition signal they had established years ago for emergency situations, right hand to heart, then extended palm up. Michael's posture changed instantly, relief visible even at this distance. He covered the remaining ground between them with long, purposeful strides. Their reunion was brief but intense, a fierce embrace that conveyed everything words could not in that moment. Then, as quickly as it had begun, both shifted back to operational focus. "Situation," Michael asked, his voice carrying the controlled tension of a soldier assessing threat conditions. "Critical," Emma replied, leading him toward the mine entrance. "Oak Ridge is under complete Scorpion control, communications jammed, multiple hostages, high-value cartel target arriving tonight." Michael absorbed this information with the rapid integration of a mind trained to process tactical data under pressure. "And your father?" "Inside. Terminal cancer, but still fighting." A shadow crossed Michael's features, concern for the father-in-law he respected, and genuine regret for Jim's condition. But there was no time for extended sympathy. The mission parameters had shifted dramatically since his initial intelligence, requiring immediate adaptation. Inside the mine, introductions were minimal, professional acknowledgments between operators who recognized in each other the shared experience of classified missions and high-stakes operations. Michael quickly established his position not through rank or assertion, but through the natural authority of expertise and capability. "Desert Scorpions aren't just a motorcycle gang," he explained, as the group gathered around the tactical table. "They're a sophisticated paramilitary organization with connections to multiple cartels and possibly state-level actors." "State-level?" Sheriff Hayes questioned. "You mean governments?" Michael nodded grimly. "Certain elements within governments. Rogue intelligence officials, military personnel with access to restricted equipment in training. Which explains their communications jamming capability," Reynolds noted. "And the advanced weapons we've observed." "Exactly," Michael confirmed. "I've been tracking them for 8 months as part of a multi-agency task force. Their operation in Oak Ridge isn't just about drug trafficking, it's about establishing a secure corridor for moving sensitive materials across the border. Materials that wouldn't survive standard inspection protocols." What kind of materials? Jim asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. Intelligence packages, weapons technology, personnel with specialized knowledge. Michael's tone conveyed the gravity of the situation. The person arriving tonight isn't cartel leadership. They're too cautious for direct involvement. It's likely a facilitator, someone who connects cartels with their governmental partners. The implications were staggering. What had appeared to be a local criminal takeover was actually part of a sophisticated international operation with potential national security implications. That changes our approach, Jim acknowledged. Disrupting the meeting becomes even more critical. Michael nodded agreement. But we still face the same tactical challenges: limited personnel, superior enemy numbers, hostage considerations. And your father-in-law's personal connection to Snake, Reynolds added. Michael's gaze shifted to Jim. You have history with Harlow. Jim explained his role in the operation that had resulted in Victor Harlow's arrest and subsequent suicide information that added another dimension to Michael's understanding of the situation. Snake's vendetta gives us leverage, Michael concluded, a predictable response pattern we can exploit. As darkness settled over the mountains, the final plan took shape: a series of coordinated actions designed to fragment the Desert Scorpion's attention and resources, culminating in an assault on the airstrip to capture both Snake and the mysterious facilitator expected to arrive. 0 hours 2200, Michael stated, checking his watch. Synchronize your timepieces. Communications on Secure Channel 3 emergency fallback to Channel 7. Primary extraction route through the Western Canyon, secondary extraction via Highway 60 if accessible. The group dispersed to final preparations, each member focused on their assigned role in the complex operation ahead. Michael pulled Emu aside, his expression softening slightly now that they were momentarily alone. I should have extracted you earlier, he said quietly, when the first intelligence about Oak Ridge came in. Emma shook her head. I wouldn't have left my father. I know. Michael acknowledged, a hint of pride in his voice. It's one of the reasons I love you. They shared a brief private moment, husband and wife connecting beneath the layers of operational necessity that had defined their relationship since Michael joined Delta Force. Then, as swiftly as it had appeared, the personal connection receded behind professional focus. Stay close during the operation, Michael instructed. We move as a unit. Emma nodded, understanding. In combat situations, Michael's protective instincts were tempered by respect for her capabilities, a balance they had established through years of honest communication about her role when his work intersected with their personal lives. Jim approached, carrying additional ammunition for the operation ahead. Time to move, he stated, his voice betraying none of the pain that Emma knew was constantly with him now. The three of them, father, daughter, husband, formed the core of the assault team that would create the primary diversion. Their mission: draw Snake's personal attention away from the airstrip long enough for Reynolds and his team to establish blocking positions for the incoming aircraft. As they prepared to depart, Jim placed a hand on Michael's shoulder. If things go sideways, Emma is your priority, not me. Understood? Michael met his father-in-law's gaze with solemn acknowledgement. Understood, sir, but my intention is to bring us all home. Jim smiled faintly. Intentions are nice. Contingency plans are better. With those words, the operation to reclaim Oak Ridge began. The night embraced them as they moved through the foothills toward Oak Ridge, three shadows navigating by starlight and memory through terrain that Jim Carroll had known since childhood. Michael led the formation, his movements economical and precise, while Emma maintained the middle position and Jim brought up the rear, setting a pace that his ailing body could sustain. In their ears, encrypted radio communications provided updates from the other teams now deployed around the perimeter of Oak Ridge. Briggs and his demolition team had reached their first target, the fuel depot, servicing the Desert Scorpion's vehicles. Sheriff Hayes and his deputies were in position near the community center where hostages were being held. Ramirez had successfully infiltrated the water treatment plant that housed the Scorpion's communications jamming equipment. All elements were in place for coordinated action at precisely 2200 hours. Michael halted the group at the edge of a ridgeline overlooking the town. Through night vision equipment, they could see Oak Ridge spread below them, streets eerily empty except for Scorpion patrols, buildings dark or illuminated, depending on their strategic value to the occupying force. Primary target identified, Michael murmured, focusing on the warehouse complex where Snake had established his headquarters. 6 guards visible, likely more inside. Vehicle bay active. Emma studied the security pattern, noting the professional spacing and alertness of the guards. No obvious vulnerabilities, she assessed. We're not looking for subtle, Jim reminded them. We're creating a spectacle. Michael nodded agreement. Maximum visibility, maximum response trigger. He checked his watch. 3 minutes to 0 hour. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. While the other teams executed their assigned disruptions across Oak Ridge, Michael, Emma, and Jim would make their presence known to Snake in a manner he couldn't ignore, a direct challenge to his authority and a trigger for his personal vendetta against Jim. At exactly 2200 hours, the night erupted into controlled chaos. From the northern edge of town, a massive explosion illuminated the darkness as Briggs's team detonated charges at the fuel depot. Secondary explosions followed as fuel tanks ignited, creating a firestorm visible for miles. Almost simultaneously, power failed across eastern Oak Ridge as Ramirez's team disabled key electrical infrastructure. In the momentary confusion this created, Michael initiated their part of the operation. From their elevated position overlooking the warehouse, he fired a single shot from a specialized rifle, not at personnel but at a transformer mounted on a utility pole adjacent to the Scorpion headquarters. The transformer exploded in a shower of sparks, plunging the warehouse and surrounding area into darkness. Before the Scorpions could activate emergency generators, Michael launched a series of illumination flares that bathed the compound in harsh, disorienting light, effectively reversing the typical tactical advantage of darkness. Transmission, now, Michael ordered, handing a specialized communication device to Jim. Jim activated the short-range broadcast system, a military-grade loudspeaker capable of projecting his voice across significant distances with clarity that cut through ambient noise. Raymond Harlow, Jim's amplified voice rolled across the compound below. This is Jim Carroll. We have unfinished business, you and I. Man to man, like your father should have had the chance for. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Activity erupted around the warehouse as Scorpions scrambled to identify the source of the transmission and establish defensive positions. Vehicle headlights swept the surrounding hillsides, and armed men poured from the building, forming a protective perimeter. Your father wasn't a coward, Ray, Jim continued, the loudspeaker carrying his words to every corner of the compound. He faced his responsibilities. Time for you to face yours. From within the warehouse emerged a figure Emma immediately recognized as Snake, his distinctive silhouette unmistakable even at this distance. He stood motionless for a moment, absorbing Jim's words, then began issuing orders to those around him. He's taking the bait, Michael observed, watching through a thermal scope as vehicles began to mobilize, diverting forces from the airstrip. Reynolds' status, Emma queried via their encrypted channel. Airstrip perimeter security reduced by approximately 40%, came the clipped response. They're responding to multiple threats. Diversion successful. Michael gave a terse nod of satisfaction. Phase 2. They retreated from their position before the Scorpions could triangulate their location, moving rapidly along a pre-planned road that would lead their pursuers away from the airstrip and the teams now converging on it. Behind them, they could hear vehicles approaching, the distinctive rumble of motorcycles and the deeper growl of SUVs navigating the rough terrain. Snake had committed significant resources to the pursuit exactly as they'd planned. Hayes, execute hostage extraction, Michael ordered via radio as they continued their strategic withdrawal. Ramirez, initiate communications blackout. Confirmations came through in quick succession, indicating that all elements of the plan were proceeding as intended. Across Oak Ridge, the carefully constructed control system established by the Desert Scorpions was unraveling thread by thread, power disruptions, communications failures, multiple security breaches requiring response. Emma checked on her father as they navigated a particularly challenging section of terrain, a steep ravine that would slow their pursuers, but also tested Jim's failing stamina. I'm fine, he assured her, though his labored breathing told a different story. Focus on the mission. They reached their planned defensive position, an abandoned ranger station overlooking a narrow approach road where pursuers would be channeled into a vulnerable formation. Michael quickly established firing positions, while Emma set up remote triggers for the non-lethal obstacles they had prepared earlier. First vehicles approaching, Michael reported, observing through his scope. Lead element is 2 motorcycles followed by 3 SUVs. Snake is in the second vehicle. Positive identification, Jim confirmed, taking position beside his son-in-law. Affirmative. He's directing the operation personally. Jim nodded satisfaction. His anger is overriding his tactical judgment, just as we hoped. As the motorcycles entered the prepared zone, Emma activated the first obstacle, caltrops scattered across the road surface, immediately disabling both bikes. The riders went down uninjured but alive, effectively blocking the narrow road. The SUVs halted their occupants, deploying into defensive positions as they assessed the ambush. Through night vision, Emma could see Snake emerging from the second vehicle, gesturing angrily as he directed his men to establish a perimeter. He knows it's a trap, Michael observed, but he's continuing anyway. Vengeance makes for poor strategy. Jim noted a hint of grim satisfaction in his voice. The Scorpions began a cautious advance using natural cover and coordinated movement that reflected their military training. Michael allowed them to progress to the second prepared position before triggering a series of flashbang grenades, non-lethal devices designed to disorient and confuse rather than injure. In the chaos that followed, Emma activated the ranger station's ancient fire suppression system, which they had modified to disperse a harmless but visually impenetrable fog across the approach road. Between the disorienting flashes and the artificial fog, the Scorpions' advance disintegrated into confusion. Reynolds' status on primary objective, Michael requested through their communications link. Aircraft approaching, came the terse reply. ETA 3 minutes. Blocking positions established. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Snake diverted from the airstrip at a crucial moment, his forces scattered across Oak Ridge, responding to multiple threats, the arriving VIP about to land without adequate security in place. Then the situation changed with the unpredictability that characterized real combat operations. Taking fire from the East Ridge, Reynolds' voice crackled through the radio. Unexpected security element heavily armed. Need immediate assistance. Michael processed this development instantly. They had a reserve force we didn't detect. The airstrip seizure is in jeopardy. Emma calculated distances and timing in her head. We're 15 minutes from their position at best. Too long, Michael concluded grimly. Reynolds can't hold that position for 15 minutes against superior numbers. Jim, who had been listening to this exchange while monitoring the confused Scorpions below, made a decision. I'll maintain this position. Keep Snake occupied. You two reinforce Reynolds. Dad, no, Emma began, immediately understanding the danger this posed to her father. It's the mission, Emma. Jim cut her off. If we lose the airstrip operation, we lose everything. Michael assessed the tactical reality with the cold clarity of a Delta operator. Jim was right, the airstrip was the primary objective. Everything else, including the diversion they had created, was secondary. I can hold them here, Jim insisted. I have the high ground prepared positions, and their confusion works in my favor. Go. After a moment of internal conflict, visible only in his eyes, Michael nodded. Maintain radio contact. Withdraw at the first sign of being outflanked. Understood, Jim agreed, though something in his tone suggested to Emma that withdrawal wasn't part of his personal calculus. Dad, she began again. I'll see you at the extraction point, Jim said firmly. Now go. That's an order. The absurdity of her civilian father giving her a military order almost made Emma smile despite the gravity of the situation. With a last lingering look at Jim, positioned behind cover with his rifle trained on the confused Scorpions below, she followed Michael as they withdrew toward their secondary transportation hidden nearby. The motorcycle Michael had concealed earlier roared to life beneath them, Emma positioned behind him as they accelerated toward the airstrip on the opposite side of Oak Ridge. They avoided main roads instead, using service pathways and dry creek beds to navigate around the town's perimeter. Reynolds were inbound, Michael transmitted. Status. Holding position but taking heavy fire, came the strained response. Aircraft on final approach. 2 minutes out. We're 4 minutes from your position, Michael replied. Can you maintain? Affirmative, but hurry. These bastards have automatic weapons and night vision. Emma felt the motorcycle surge forward as Michael pushed it to its limits, navigating the treacherous terrain at speeds that bordered on reckless. They both knew that Reynolds and his team were likely outnumbered and outgunned, holding a position they couldn't retreat from without compromising the entire operation. Behind them, sporadic gunfire indicated that Jim was engaging the Scorpions at the ranger station, keeping Snake's attention focused away from the airstrip for as long as possible. Emma forced herself to concentrate on the mission ahead rather than the father she'd left behind. They reached the edge of the cleared area surrounding the makeshift airstrip, just as landing lights appeared in the night sky, the approaching aircraft now visible as a small executive jet making its final descent. Reynolds and his team were pinned down at the northern perimeter, exchanging fire with what appeared to be professionally equipped security forces positioned in the tree line. "I count 12 hostiles," Michael assessed quickly. "Well-armed, tactically positioned, likely ex-military contractors. They're focusing on Reynolds," Emma noted. "They haven't spotted us yet." Michael nodded, formulating a plan with the rapid tactical processing that made Delta operators so effective. "We flank from the east, hit them from behind while Reynolds holds their attention." They abandoned the motorcycle and advanced on foot, using natural cover to approach the security team's position undetected. The aircraft was now on final approach, its engines changing pitch as it prepared to land on the crude runway, illuminated by portable lights. Michael paused briefly, ensuring Emma was positioned correctly before they initiated their assault. His expression held the focused intensity she had seen before previous operations, not coldness, but rather the complete concentration of a mind fully engaged in life-or-death calculations. "On my mark," he whispered, barely audible over the approaching aircraft. Emma readied herself, controlling her breathing as adrenaline surged through her system. Now, their attack was swift and precisely coordinated, Michael targeting the security team's leader and communications specialist, while Emma engaged supporting elements with disabling rather than lethal fire. The surprise was complete, catching the security team in a devastating crossfire between Michael and Emma's flanking position and Reynolds' frontal engagement. Within minutes, the security team was neutralized, most wounded rather than killed, testament to the disciplined fire control exercised by Michael's improvised force. Reynolds and his team emerged from their defensive positions, moving quickly to establish a perimeter around the landing zone as the aircraft touched down. "Status on the warehouse team," Michael demanded as they converged on the runway. "Briggs reports Snake abandoned the pursuit approximately 3 minutes ago," Reynolds replied. "Apparently received word about the airstrip situation. He's inbound with reinforcements." Emma felt cold dread settle in her stomach. Dad, Reynolds' expression confirmed her fears. "No contact since you left his position." No time to process that now. The aircraft had completed its landing roll and was taxiing toward the crude terminal. The Scorpions had established little more than a reinforced shed with basic facilities for processing arrivals outside normal channels. "Secure that aircraft," Michael ordered. "No one exits until we have complete control." Reynolds deployed his team in standard containment formation, while Michael and Emma approached the aircraft directly with weapons at ready position, but not directly threatening. The aircraft's door opened, revealing a flight crew member who froze at the sight of armed individuals replacing the expected reception committee. "Federal operation," Michael announced with the authority of his position. "All occupants will exit slowly with hands visible." For a tense moment, it appeared the aircraft's occupants might resist. Then a voice from within the cabin instructed the crew member to comply. Slowly, the plane's passengers emerged, first the remainder of the flight crew, then 2 bodyguards who were quickly disarmed by Reynolds' team. Finally, the primary passenger appeared, a slender man in his 50s, immaculately dressed in a tailored suit that seemed incongruous in the crude surroundings. He surveyed the situation with evident displeasure, but no particular alarm. "I presume you are not my scheduled reception," he observed dryly, his accent suggesting South American education refined by European finishing. "United States government," Michael replied without specifying agency. "You're being detained for questioning regarding illegal entry and suspected involvement with criminal organizations." The man sighed as if merely inconvenienced. "I have diplomatic immunity. My papers are entirely in order." "That will be determined by appropriate authorities," Michael responded, gesturing for Reynolds to secure the man. "In the meantime, you're considered a material witness in an ongoing federal investigation," as Reynolds escorted the mysterious facilitator to a secure holding position. Distant engine sounds announced the approach of vehicles, Snake and his reinforcements arriving too late to prevent the aircraft's seizure. "Defensive positions," Michael ordered. "We hold this airstrip until extraction arrives." Emma, monitoring their perimeter, caught movement at the far edge of the runway, a single motorcycle approaching from an unexpected direction. Not part of the inbound Scorpion force, but moving with purpose toward their position. Unknown contact northwest perimeter. She reported, training her weapon on the approaching figure. The motorcycle halted just beyond effective small arms range, its rider remaining seated but removing his helmet to reveal a familiar face. Agent Fostered, the man who had visited Carol's auto repair, claiming to be FBI. He's trying to determine our strength, Michael assessed. Reconnaissance for Snake's main force. The false agent observed their positions for several moments before replacing his helmet and accelerating away, clearly reporting back to his superiors. Reinforcements are 3 minutes out based on engine sounds. Reynolds estimated, rejoining them after securing the facilitator. An extraction, Emma asked. Michael checked his watch. 15 minutes minimum. We need to hold this position. They hastily improved their defensive setup, using the aircraft itself as cover and establishing clear fields of fire across the open runway. The facilitator and his entourage were secured inside the terminal building under guard, while the remaining team members deployed to defensive positions around the perimeter. Emma found herself positioned beside Michael, both covering the main approach road where Snake's forces would most likely appear. "Any word from my father?" she asked quietly, the question she'd been holding back finally escaping. Michael's expression remained professionally focused, but his voice softened slightly. "Nothing yet, but Jim is resourceful. He knows how to disappear when necessary." Emma nodded, choosing to believe this assessment rather than confront alternatives too painful to consider in the midst of an operation. The distant headlights resolved into a convoy of vehicles approaching the airstrip, at least 6 motorcycles and 4 SUVs, based on the pattern of lights. Snake had consolidated significant force for this counterattack, recognizing the critical importance of the facilitator to his operation. "Hold fire until they commit to the open ground," Michael instructed over their tactical frequency. "Let them advance to maximum vulnerability before engaging." The Desert Scorpions approached with caution, establishing a perimeter at the edge of the runway rather than charging directly into potential ambush. Snake clearly retained enough tactical awareness to recognize the disadvantage of his position approaching a defended airfield across open ground with limited cover. Through her scope, Emma could see Snake himself directing operations from the lead vehicle, his distinctive silhouette unmistakable as he assessed the situation with professional detachment. Despite everything, she found herself respecting his tactical competence, even while opposing everything he represented. "They're deploying to encircle us," Reynolds observed. "Classic siege approach. They know we have their VIP and are settling in to wait us out." "Time works against us," Michael noted grimly. "Our extraction window is narrow, and they outnumber us significantly." The standoff continued for several tense minutes, Snake's forces gradually establishing a complete perimeter around the airstrip, while Michael's team maintained their defensive positions around the aircraft and terminal. Neither side initiated fire, each recognizing the potential cost of precipitous action. Then an unexpected development shifted the tactical equation dramatically. From beyond the perimeter established by the Desert Scorpions, multiple explosions erupted in quick succession, precision strikes targeting their vehicles with uncanny accuracy. Confusion spread through the Scorpion ranks as they attempted to identify this new threat approaching from their unprotected rear. "What the hell?" Reynolds muttered, scanning for the source of this unexpected assistance. Through her scope, Emma caught glimpses of figures moving through the darkness behind the Scorpion positions. Disciplined, coordinated movement that suggested professional military training. Michael's radio crackled to life with an unfamiliar voice. "Anvil actual to Delta 1. Coming in hot from your southwest quadrant. Friendlies marked with infrared identifiers. How copy?" Michael's expression shifted to one of cautious optimism. "Solid copy, Anvil actual. Delta 1 authenticates Sierra Echo 93. "Authentication confirmed," the voice responded. "Cavalry has arrived, gentlemen. Try not to shoot us as we clean up your mess." The night erupted into controlled chaos as a professional military unit engaged the Desert Scorpions from behind precise, disciplined fire that targeted key personnel and vehicles while avoiding civilian infrastructure. The Scorpions, caught between this new threat and Michael's established position, found themselves in the tactician's nightmare of a hammer and anvil scenario. "Who the hell is Anvil Actual?" Reynolds demanded. 75th Ranger Regiment? Michael replied, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. Our extraction just arrived ahead of schedule. Emma watched in amazement as the professional military unit systematically dismantled Snake's defensive perimeter, neutralizing threats with surgical precision while establishing control over the increasingly chaotic battlefield. These weren't the aging veterans of their impromptu resistance, but active-duty special operations forces with current training and equipment. You called in the Rangers, she asked Michael, understanding dawning. Contingency plan, he confirmed. When communications were jammed, I activated an emergency protocol before entering the area. Wasn't certain it got through. The firefight was brief but intense, ending with the Desert Scorpions surrounded and outgunned by superior forces. Snake himself, recognizing the inevitability of defeat, attempted to withdraw with a small security detail, only to find his escape route blocked by Rangers who had anticipated this response. As the shooting subsided, replaced by the systematic processing of prisoners and securing of the area, Emma's thoughts returned to her father. The Ranger commander approached their position, his helmet-mounted equipment giving him an almost otherworldly appearance in the darkness. Major Harrington's 75th Regiment, he introduced himself. We've secured the perimeter and are processing tangos. Full containment expected within 30 minutes. Appreciate the assistance, Major, Michael responded. We have a high-value detainee in the terminal building. Potential diplomatic complications. The Major nodded understanding. Already coordinated with State Department and Justice. Extraction helicopter inbound for your package. ETA 15 minutes. Emma interrupted this professional exchange with the question consuming her. Major, do you have any information about a man at the old ranger station, James Carroll, my father? Harrington consulted briefly with his communications specialist before responding. Affirmative. One civilian located at that position approximately 20 minutes ago. Wounded but stable. Already evacuated to our field medical station. Relief flooded through Emma, so intense she momentarily struggled to maintain her professional composure. Thank you, she managed. As the Rangers established complete control over the airstrip and surrounding area, the true extent of their operation became clear. This wasn't just a response to Michael's emergency signal, but a coordinated federal action against the entire Desert Scorpions network, simultaneously striking multiple locations across the Southwest in a carefully planned takedown of the organization's infrastructure. How long has this been in preparation? Emma asked as they observed Rangers processing captured Scorpions, including Snake himself, now disarmed and restrained, his expression a mixture of fury and resignation. 8 months, Michael replied. My assignment was intelligence gathering on their Oak Ridge operation. The larger federal response was scheduled for next week, but your situation accelerated the timeline. Emma absorbed this information, understanding now that Michael's absence hadn't been routine deployment, but part of a complex counter-cartel operation. The pieces fit together: his cryptic communications, the urgency of his return when she reported Desert Scorpions in Oak Ridge, his immediate grasp of the broader significance of their activities, and my father's connection to Snake. Unknown until you reported it, Michael admitted. That added a personal dimension we hadn't anticipated. A helicopter appeared on the horizon, its approach lighting cutting through the night sky as it prepared to land on the now secured airstrip. This would be the extraction for their captured facilitator, the mysterious figure whose arrival had been the catalyst for the night's events. As the Rangers prepared for this transfer, Emma and Michael made their way to the field medical station, established on the edge of the airstrip, a series of tactical shelters where wounded from both sides were receiving treatment. They found Jim on a military stretcher, an IV in his arm, and bandages covering wounds to his left shoulder and leg. Despite his injuries, he was conscious and alert, his expression brightening as he saw Emma and Michael approach. Took you long enough, he greeted them, his voice weaker, but still carrying the dry humor that characterized him. Emma embraced her father carefully, mindful of his injuries. What happened to "I'll see you at the extraction point"? Slight change of plans, Jim replied. Snake's men were more persistent than anticipated. Had to discourage them rather firmly. The medical officer attending Jim approached with a tablet displaying test results. Mr. Carroll has suffered moderate blood loss from gunshot wounds to the shoulder and thigh, non-critical injuries that would typically require routine hospitalization. He paused, his expression softening slightly. However, comprehensive blood work revealed his underlying condition. I'm afraid the metastatic cancer is extensive. Emma nodded, having already accepted this reality. His oncologist gave him 2 months. That was 4 months ago. The medical officer's respect was evident in his tone. He's quite remarkable. Most patients with this level of disease progression wouldn't have been capable of the physical exertion involved in tonight's operation. Stubbornness runs in the family, Jim commented dryly. As the medical officer departed to attend other patients, Jim grasped Emma's hand firmly. Did you get him, Snake? Rangers have him in custody, Michael confirmed, along with most of his organization and their VIP visitor. The operation was a complete success. Jim nodded satisfaction, settling back against his pillow. Worth it then. The three of them remained together as activity swirled around them. Rangers processing, prisoners, medical teams, treating wounded intelligence officers, beginning the massive task of documenting the night's events. In this pocket of relative calm, they were simply family, father, daughter, husband, connected by bonds that transcended the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them to this moment. 3 months later, Emma stood on the newly rebuilt porch of Carol's Auto Repair, watching as the morning sun illuminated Oak Ridge with golden light. The town was healing, buildings repaired, businesses reopened, a sense of normalcy gradually returning to streets that had briefly known occupation and conflict. The federal operation against the Desert Scorpions had extended far beyond Oak Ridge, dismantling a criminal network that stretched across 3 states and into Mexico. Ray Snake Harlow and his lieutenants faced multiple federal charges, ensuring they would never again threaten communities like this one. The mysterious facilitator, ultimately identified as a former intelligence operative working for a South American conglomerate, had provided evidence against higher-level conspirators in exchange for considerations in his own case. Oak Ridge itself had become something of a local legend, the small town that had resisted organized crime through the courage of its citizens and the leadership of a dying mechanic with a remarkable past. Behind Emma, the interior of Carol's Auto Repair hummed with activity, mechanics working on vehicles, customers chatting in the waiting area, the ordinary business of small-town life continuing as it had for generations. The fire that had destroyed the original building had provided an opportunity for rebuilding a larger facility with modern equipment, though Jim had insisted on preserving the character and name that had defined the business for decades. Michael emerged from the office area, wiping hands that now bore the honest grime of mechanical work rather than the remnants of combat operations. Johnson's Cadillac is finished, he reported, fixed that electrical issue that's been driving him crazy for months. Emma smiled at the transformation her husband had undergone since their ordeal. After completing his obligations to the federal task force, Michael had accepted early retirement from Delta Force, choosing to remain in Oak Ridge and help Jim run the family business for whatever time remained to him. It was a decision that had surprised many of Michael's colleagues, but made perfect sense to those who understood what family meant to him. Jim Carroll had become the father figure Michael had never had in his own life, and the opportunity to learn from him both about mechanics and about life was more valuable than any continued military career could offer. "Where is Dad?" Emma asked, noting Jim's absence from his usual morning position behind the service counter. "Doctor's appointment," Michael replied. "Said he'd be back by noon." The medical prognosis hadn't changed. Jim's cancer remained terminal, but his condition had stabilized somewhat after proper treatment, giving him precious additional months of relatively good quality life. He had refused aggressive interventions that might extend his lifespan at the cost of his ability to function, instead choosing palliative care that allowed him to continue working and teaching Michael the business he would eventually inherit. "Sheriff Hayes called," Michael continued. "Reynolds and the others are getting together at the Oak Ridge Inn tonight. Something about celebrating 3 months since the liberation." He smiled slightly at the grandiose terminology the townspeople had adopted for the events of that night. Emma nodded. Most of their impromptu resistance fighters had remained in or near Oak Ridge, forming an unofficial veterans group that met regularly to reminisce and support one another. They had found renewed purpose in their twilight years, their experiences providing perspective and guidance for a community rebuilding itself. The sound of a familiar vehicle drew their attention. Jim's restored 1967 Mustang's Yum project he had been working on when the Desert Scorpions first appeared in Oak Ridge. Now completed, the classic car represented everything Jim valued: American craftsmanship, mechanical precision, and the rewards of patient, skilled labor. Jim parked carefully in his reserve spot and emerged with the deliberate movements of a man managing constant pain through sheer determination. Despite his condition, he insisted on driving himself to appointments, maintaining independence for as long as physically possible. "Good news?" Emma asked hopefully as her father approached. Jim shrugged, the gesture characteristic of his matter-of-fact approach to his illness. "Same as always? Still dying, just not as quickly as they expected." His smile softened the bluntness of his words. "Doctor says I'm defying statistical probability. Told him I've been doing that most of my life." Inside the garage office, Jim settled into his favorite chair, positioned to observe both the workshop floor and the customer service area. From this vantage point, he could supervise operations while conserving his limited energy, offering guidance when needed, but increasingly allowing Michael to manage day-to-day responsibilities. Mail came, Jim noted, indicating a stack of envelopes on the desk. "Including something official looking for you, Michael." Michael sorted through the correspondence, pausing at a thick envelope bearing federal government markings. He opened it carefully, reading the enclosed letter with measured expression before passing it to Emma. "Presidential Unit Citation," she read aloud, "for extraordinary heroism in military operations against an armed enemy." She looked up at Michael questioningly. "For the Rangers who responded that night," he explained. "I'm mentioned as associated personnel, hence the courtesy copy." Jim nodded approval. "Well deserved. Those boys knew what they were doing." "They had good intelligence," Michael replied, the compliment to his own work understated but clear. As the morning progressed into afternoon, Emma observed the easy rhythm that had developed between her father and husband, two men from different generations and backgrounds, united by similar values and experiences. They communicated in the shorthand of professionals who respected each other's capabilities, occasionally disagreeing on methods, but always aligned on fundamentals. When Jim eventually retired to his office for his customary afternoon rest, Emma joined Michael in the workshop area where he was diagnosing an electrical problem in a customer's truck. "You're happy here," she observed. Not a question, but a confirmation of what she had witnessed over recent months. Michael considered this as he methodically traced a wiring harness. "I am," he acknowledged. "It's different from what I expected for retirement, but it fits." "Dad's teaching you everything he knows," Emma noted. "All the skills, all the customer relationships, preparing you to carry on when he's gone." "I know," Michael replied quietly. "It's a responsibility I take seriously." Emma leaned against the workbench, watching her husband's capable hands moving with increasing confidence through mechanical systems he was still learning to master. "And us, are we staying in Oak Ridge permanently?" Michael straightened, giving the question his full attention. "Do you want to? Your teaching position in Phoenix is still open?" Emma glanced around the garage that had been part of her life since childhood. The business her grandfather had founded, her father had maintained, and her husband was now learning to operate. The legacy was tangible in every corner of the building, in the relationships with customers that spanned generations, in the trust the community placed in the Carroll name. "I think," she said slowly, "that some traditions are worth preserving. Some places are worth fighting for. Some legacies deserve to continue." Michael understood the deeper meaning behind her words. "Then we stay, make this our home, build our future here." The decision felt right, as natural evolution of the path they had been on since the night Oak Ridge was liberated. Michael had found purpose beyond military service. Emma had reconnected with her roots while discovering new aspects of herself during their ordeal. Later that evening, as they prepared to join the gathering at the Oak Ridge Inn, Emma helped her father with his jacket, an increasingly difficult task as his physical strength diminished. "I have something to tell you," she said, securing the last button. "Something important." Jim studied his daughter's face, reading the significance in her expression. "Good news, I hope?" Emma nodded, emotion making it momentarily difficult to speak. "I'm pregnant, Dad. Due in about 7 months." Jim's face transformed, the pain and fatigue that had become his constant companions temporarily banished by pure joy. "A grandchild," he breathed the words themselves, seeming to give him renewed energy. "Boy or girl?" "Too early to know," Emma replied, smiling through tears that had appeared unbidden. "But the doctor says everything looks perfect." Jim embraced his daughter carefully, his voice thick with emotion. "Perfect timing. Gives me something to stick around for." The unspoken reality hung between them. Jim's prognosis made it unlikely he would live to see his grandchild's birth. But the possibility, however remote, provided new purpose, new determination to extend his remaining time as much as possible. Michael joined them immediately, sensing the emotional moment he had interrupted. Everything okay? Better than okay, Jim replied, not bothering to hide the moisture in his eyes. I'm going to be a grandfather. Understanding dawned on Michael's face as he realized Emma had shared their news. He moved to stand beside his wife, one arm circling her waist in a gesture of unity and support. We're thinking James for a boy, he said quietly, after his grandfather. Jim nodded clearly, touched beyond words by this tribute. After a moment of composed silence, he straightened his shoulders and gestured toward the door. Well, we shouldn't keep the others waiting. Special occasion after all. As they drove through Oak Ridge toward the inn where their friends awaited, Emma observed the town with renewed perspective, seeing it now not just as the place of her childhood or the site of their recent conflict, but as the community where her child would be born and raised, where Carroll's auto repair would continue into another generation, where the legacy of James Carroll would endure through his grandchild and the business that bore his name. At the Oak Ridge Inn, they were greeted warmly by the assembled company, Reynolds, Briggs, Ramirez, Sheriff Hayes, and others who had stood with them against the Desert Scorpions. These men who had found renewed purpose through crisis had become extended family in the months since regular fixtures at the garage, frequent dinner guests at the Carroll home, honorary uncles, to the child yet to be born. As toasts were raised, celebrating 3 months of restored freedom, Emma found herself contemplating the strange circumstances that had brought them all together. A dying mechanic with a secret past, a Delta Force operator searching for meaning beyond combat, a woman discovering her own strength in the crucible of crisis, and a community that had briefly known occupation before reclaiming its independence. The story of Oak Ridge would be told and retold for generations, how a mechanic's daughter was tied with chains by bikers, and how her Delta Force husband broke them apart. But the deeper story, the one Emma would someday share with her child, was about family legacy and the courage to stand against darkness, however it manifested. Outside the inn's windows, Oak Ridge continued its evening routines, lights glowing and homes residents moving about their business, the ordinary rhythm of small-town life restored after extraordinary disruption. In this moment of reflection, Emma recognized the true victory they had won, not just the defeat of the Desert Scorpions, but the preservation of a way of life, a community, a tradition worth protecting. As Jim Carroll raised his glass in a final toast to family, both blood and chosen, Emma placed a protective hand over her still flat stomach, where a new generation was already growing, ensuring that the Carroll legacy would continue long after its namesake had departed. Some change, she reflected, bind us to our past and our future in ways that give meaning to the present. Those were chains worth preserving, even as they had fought to break the literal chains of those who had threatened everything they held dear. In Oak Ridge, Arizona, life continued. And in Carroll's Auto Repair, a tradition endured, a family business, a community anchor, a legacy passing from one generation to the next.